Welcome back. My name is Hugo. Tonight, I want to take you on a long journey through one of philosophy's oldest and most mysterious questions: death and what might come after. For thousands of years, people have wondered what it really means to die and whether something of us continues beyond this life. Philosophers, poets, and entire cultures have tried to make sense of it, not only to ease fear, but also to understand what it means to truly live. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly explore the philosophy of death and the afterlife together. But before we dive into these philosophical depths, let me share something that might surprise you. The fear of death, which psychologists call thanatophobia, affects nearly every human being on the planet. Yet throughout history, certain individuals have found ways not just to accept mortality, but to embrace it as the very thing that gives life its meaning and urgency. They've discovered something remarkable: that confronting death directly rather than avoiding it can lead to the most profound sense of peace and purpose imaginable. What I'm going to reveal in this exploration goes far beyond simple comfort or consolation. We're going to uncover how different philosophical traditions have approached the ultimate mystery, and how their insights can offer you practical wisdom for navigating not just the prospect of death, but the art of truly who taught that death is nothing to us living. From Epicurus to Heidegger, who argued that authentic existence requires constant awareness of our mortality, to Buddhist teachings that see death as merely one transition in an endless cycle of becoming. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why some of history's greatest thinkers considered the study of death to be the highest form of philosophy. You'll discover how facing mortality honestly can liberate you from countless fears and anxieties that diminish daily life. And perhaps most importantly, you'll learn how these ancient wisdoms can guide you toward what many philosophers consider the ultimate goal of human existence: a life lived with complete presence, authentic meaning, and profound peace. Let's begin where Western philosophy itself began, in the sun-drenched gardens of ancient Greece, where a man named Epicurus first dared to claim that death itself was an illusion. The Garden of Epicurus. Death as nothing. Picture yourself walking through the ancient city of Athens in the 3rd century before Christ. The marble temples gleam white against the azure sky, and in a quiet garden outside the city walls, a small community has gathered around a philosopher whose ideas about death would echo through the centuries. Epicurus, a man whose very name has been misunderstood by history, sits among his followers, both men and women, slaves and free citizens, sharing what he considers the most liberating truth human beings can comprehend. Death, he says with quiet conviction, is nothing to us. At first hearing, this statement might sound callous or naive. How can death be nothing when it seems like everything, the final boundary that gives shape to all human experience? But Epicurus isn't speaking carelessly. He's offering what he believes to be the ultimate medicine for human suffering, a philosophical cure for the anxiety that haunts every conscious being. His reasoning unfolds with elegant simplicity. Good and evil, pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, all exist only in sensation. They require a conscious being to experience them. Death, by definition, is the complete absence of sensation. Therefore, when death arrives, there is no you present to experience it as good or evil, pleasant or unpleasant. The subject of the experience has dissolved entirely. Where death is, Epicurus explains, I am not. Where I am, death is not. Therefore, death and I can never meet. This isn't merely clever wordplay. Epicurus is pointing toward a profound shift in perspective that can transform how we relate to mortality. The fear of death, he argues, is really the fear of something that can never actually be experienced. We fear the pain of dying, which is understandable, but we also fear the state of being dead, which is literally nonsensical. It's like fearing the color blue when you're blind, or fearing silence when you're deaf. But Epicurus goes deeper. He observes that we don't suffer from the countless eons before our birth when we didn't exist. The infinite time before consciousness emerged wasn't experienced as deprivation or loss. Why, then, should we fear returning to that same state of non-being? The symmetry is perfect. Just as we emerged from nothingness without suffering, we return to nothingness without suffering. This insight creates what Epicureans call ataraxia, a state of serene tranquility that comes from releasing unnecessary fears. When you truly grasp that death cannot harm you because there will be no you present wait to be harmed, a tremendous lifts from daily existence. The time you have is revealed as precious precisely because it is limited, but the ending of that time is revealed as nothing to fear. Consider how this shifts your relationship to mortality. Instead of death being a terrible enemy lurking at the edges of consciousness, it becomes more like the frame around a painting. The frame isn't part of the artwork, but it gives the painting its boundaries, its definition, its completion. Death gives life its shape without being part of life itself. This doesn't mean Epicurus advocated for reckless living or indifference to others' deaths. Quite the opposite. Because this life is all we have, because death truly is the end of our capacity for experience, every moment becomes infinitely precious. The Epicurean doesn't fear death, but neither does he court it. Instead, he dedicates himself fully to the art of living well, knowing that existence is a temporary gift to be savored completely. The practical implications of this philosophy extend far beyond abstract theorizing. When you no longer carry the background anxiety about your ultimate fate, energy is freed up for full engagement with present experience. Decisions become clearer because they're not clouded by existential dread. Relationships deepen because time together is recognized as finite and therefore precious. Simple pleasures, what Epicurus called the pure pleasures of friendship, contemplation, and peaceful satisfaction, are revealed as the highest goods available to human beings. Yet, even as we find wisdom in Epicurus's insights, other voices from across the philosophical spectrum offer different perspectives on mortality's meaning. Some argue that far from being nothing to us, death is the very thing that gives life its authenticity and urgency. Heidegger and Being Toward Death. Fast forward over 2 millennia from the gardens of ancient Athens to the lecture halls of 20th century Germany. Here, Martin Heidegger, one of the most influential and controversial philosophers of the modern era, presents a radically different view of death's significance. For Heidegger, death isn't something to be dismissed or transcended, but the fundamental possibility that gives all other possibilities their meaning. Heidegger introduces a concept he calls being toward death, which sounds abstract but points toward something every human being intuitively understands. Unlike other animals, humans live with constant awareness of their mortality. This awareness isn't just an intellectual fact we carry around, but the background condition that shapes every choice, every relationship, every moment of conscious existence. Think about how differently you would live if you knew with absolute certainty that you would never die. Would achievements matter in the same way? Would relationships carry the same intensity? Would any decision feel truly urgent? Heidegger argues that mortality isn't just one fact among others about human existence, it's the fundamental structure that makes authentic existence possible. But here's where Heidegger's analysis becomes both profound and disturbing. Most people, he argues, spend their lives fleeing from authentic awareness of death. We lose ourselves in what he calls the they self, the anonymous social roles and conventional behaviors that provide the comfortable illusion that we're just like everyone else, part of an eternal collective that doesn't really die. We distract ourselves with busy work, social media, entertainment, shopping, anything to avoid confronting the stark reality that our time is limited and our death is absolutely certain. We treat death as something that happens to other people, something far in the future, something that medical technology might eventually solve. This flight from mortality, Heidegger suggests, is simultaneously a flight from authenticity. Authentic existence, in Heidegger's framework, requires what he calls running ahead into death. This doesn't mean becoming morbidly obsessed with dying, but rather allowing the reality of mortality to inform every aspect of how you live. When you truly accept that your time is finite, that your death is inevitable, and that this death will be yours alone, something remarkable happens. The trivial concerns that normally consume mental energy begin to fall away. The opinions of others matter less. Social conventions lose their power to dictate your choices. Instead of being paralyzed by mortality, authentic awareness of death becomes liberating. It reveals what Heidegger calls your own most possibilities, the ways of being that are uniquely yours rather than copies of how others live. Death, being the one experience that cannot be shared or delegated, throws you back upon yourself and forces the question, what kind of being do you want to be in the time you have? This creates what existentialist philosophers call authentic anxiety, a fundamental uneasiness that comes not from any specific threat, but from confronting the groundlessness of existence itself. You exist, you will die, and in between these two certainties you must create meaning without any guarantee that the meaning you create has cosmic significance. This anxiety is uncomfortable, but Heidegger sees it as the price of authenticity. The practical implications of being toward death extend into every domain of human experience. In relationships, authentic awareness of mortality creates both greater intimacy and greater independence. You love others more intensely because you know the time together is limited, but you also avoid losing yourself in relationships because you recognize that your death will ultimately be faced alone. In work and creativity, mortality awareness shifts focus from external validation to intrinsic meaning. The question becomes not what will others think, but what kind of trace do I want to leave on existence during my brief time here? This often leads to more courageous choices, more authentic expression, and less concern with conventional success metrics. Perhaps most importantly, being toward death transforms the relationship to time itself. Instead of time being an abstract container that stretches indefinitely into the future, it becomes a finite resource demanding conscious allocation. Each moment carries weight because moments are limited. Each choice matters because there won't be infinite opportunities to choose differently. Yet even as Heidegger's insights illuminate the authenticity that can emerge from confronting mortality, other philosophical traditions offer different maps for navigating the territory of death and meaning. Some suggest that individual death is itself an illusion, part of a larger pattern of transformation that extends far beyond a single lifetime. The Buddhist path, death as transformation. In the quiet meditation halls of ancient monasteries, where centuries of contemplatives have sat in silent investigation of existence itself, a radically different understanding of death has emerged. Buddhism, born from the insights of Siddhartha Gautama over 25 centuries ago, presents mortality not as an ending, but as one movement in an endless dance of transformation. The story begins with a young prince who had been sheltered from all knowledge of aging, sickness, and death. When Siddhartha finally encountered these realities, he was so profoundly shaken that he abandoned his palace, his wealth, and his family to seek understanding. What he discovered through years of intense spiritual practice became the foundation for one of humanity's great wisdom traditions. The Buddha's first noble truth is perhaps the most honest statement ever made about the human condition. Life contains suffering. This isn't pessimism, but clear-eyed recognition of what every conscious being experiences. We suffer because we're born into bodies that age. We suffer because we form attachments to things that inevitably change or disappear. We suffer because we want existence to be permanent, when impermanence is its fundamental characteristic. But the Buddhist understanding of death flows from an even more radical insight. The self that fears death is itself an illusion. What we normally think of as me or I is actually a constantly changing stream of physical sensations, emotions, thoughts, and consciousness. There's no permanent, unchanging essence that could be destroyed by death. Instead, what we call death is simply another moment of transformation in a process that never stops. Imagine a river flowing from mountain to sea. At any given moment, you can point to the water and say, "This is the river." But the water you're pointing to is never the same from moment to moment. New water constantly flows in as old water flows away. The river maintains its identity through constant change. Buddhist teaching suggests that consciousness works similarly. What we call self is more like a river than a rock, more like a flame than a statue. This doesn't mean Buddhism denies the reality of individual experience. The pain of loss is real. The love between people is real. The fear of death is real. But these experiences arise within a larger context of interconnectedness and constant transformation. Death becomes not the termination of existence, but a transition within existence, like ice melting into water or water evaporating into vapor. The Buddhist concept of rebirth extends this understanding. Consciousness, like energy in physics, neither appears from nothing nor disappears into nothing. It transforms according to patterns established by actions and intentions during life. This isn't the same as believing in an eternal soul that travels from body to body. Rather, It's understanding that the karmic patterns we create through our choices continue to unfold even after the particular body-mind complex we identify as self dissolves. But perhaps the most practical aspect of Buddhist death philosophy lies in its meditation practices. Contemplation of death, or Maranasati, is considered one of the most powerful tools for spiritual development. Practitioners are encouraged to reflect on the deeply certainty of death, the uncertainty of its timing, and the fact that nothing except spiritual development can help at the moment of dying. This isn't morbid fascination, but practical training. By regularly confronting mortality in meditation, the practitioner gradually releases attachment to things that cannot provide lasting security. Wealth, status, even relationships are revealed as temporary phenomena that can enrich life but cannot prevent death. This recognition leads to what Buddhists call letting go, a gradual release of the grasping that causes suffering. The meditation on death also cultivates what Buddhism terms mindfulness of impermanence. Every breath becomes precious because you know there will be a last breath. Every moment of consciousness becomes valuable because consciousness itself is revealed as a rare and fragile gift. Instead of taking existence for granted, the practitioner develops a sense of wonder and gratitude for the simple fact of being aware. Advanced practitioners sometimes engage in more intensive death contemplation, visualizing the dissolution of the body and the gradual fading of sensory experience. This isn't meant to create fear, but to familiarize the mind with the death process so that when it actually occurs, it can be met with equanimity rather than panic. Some traditions even practice specific techniques for maintaining awareness during the dying process itself, viewing death as an opportunity for liberation rather than unconscious dissolution. The ethical implications of Buddhist death philosophy are profound. If consciousness continues in some form after physical death, then actions have consequences that extend beyond a single lifetime. The kindness or cruelty you express doesn't just affect others in the present moment, but shapes the ongoing patterns of consciousness that will unfold after your death. This creates a natural incentive for ethical behavior based not on external commands, but on understanding the interconnected nature of existence. Yet, as we explore these different philosophical approaches to mortality, we encounter traditions that embrace the uncertainty itself, finding in our finite, groundless existence not cause for despair, but invitation to create meaning through the very act of living authentically. The existentialist confrontation, creating meaning in the face of nothingness. In the smoky cafes of post-war Paris, where intellectuals gathered to make sense of a world that had witnessed unprecedented destruction, a new philosophical movement was taking shape. The existentialists, led by figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, faced mortality with neither the serene acceptance of Epicurus nor the spiritual transformation promised by Buddhism. Instead, they embraced what might seem like the most terrifying possibility of all, that death is final, that existence has no predetermined meaning, and that we are radically free to create our own purpose in the brief span between birth and oblivion. Sartre's famous declaration that existence precedes essence carries implications profound for how we understand mortality. Unlike a tool which is designed for a specific purpose before it's created, human beings exist first and only afterward create their essence through the choices they make. This means there's no cosmic blueprint for how you should live, no divine plan that gives your life inherent meaning, no natural purpose that death either fulfills or interrupts. This might sound depressing, but the existentialists found it exhilarating. If there's no predetermined meaning to life, then you're completely free to create whatever meaning you choose. Death becomes not the destroyer of meaning, but the condition that makes meaning possible. Without the pressure of limited time, without the urgency created by mortality, would any choice really matter? Would love carry the same intensity if it could last forever? Would courage mean anything if there were no real risks to face? Camus took this line of thinking even further with his philosophy of the absurd. Life, he argued, is fundamentally absurd because we desperately seek meaning and purpose in a universe that offers neither. We cry out for answers, and the cosmos responds with silence. We demand justice, and reality provides in for immortality and we difference. We long get 70 or 80 years if we're lucky, but rather than seeing this absurdity as cause for despair, Camus saw it as an opportunity for a particular kind of heroism. He told the story of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a mountain for eternity, only to watch it roll back down each time he reached the summit. This, Camus suggested, is the human condition. We struggle against mortality, we build civilizations and create art and form relationships, knowing that everything we create will eventually be destroyed. The key insight is that Sisyphus can choose his attitude toward his eternal task. He can push the boulder in despair, viewing his labor as meaningless punishment, or he can embrace his fate, finding dignity and even joy in the struggle itself. Camus famously concluded, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This happiness doesn't come from denying the reality of death or finding some transcendent meaning that makes mortality acceptable. It comes from full acceptance of the human condition, combined with defiant commitment to creating value and meaning despite the absence of cosmic guarantees." The existentialist doesn't fear death because it ends meaning. Instead, they use the reality of death to intensify and authenticate the meaning they create while alive. Simone de Beauvoir extended these insights into the realm of ethics and relationships. If we're all facing the same fundamental predicament, if we're all mortal beings trying to create meaning in an indifferent universe, then we have a natural solidarity with one another. The authentic response to mortality isn't withdrawal into private anguish, but engagement with others who share the same condition. We're all thrown into existence without choosing it, and we'll all face death whether we want to or not. This shared vulnerability becomes the foundation for genuine compassion and ethical responsibility. The practical implications of existentialist death philosophy are both challenging and liberating. On one hand, you can't comfort yourself with beliefs about afterlives or cosmic purposes that might make mortality easier to accept. There's no appeal to higher authority to justify your choices or give your life meaning from outside yourself. This can create what Kierkegaard called anxiety, and what modern existentialists term existential dread, a deep uneasiness that comes from recognizing your radical freedom and responsibility. On the other hand, this same recognition can be profoundly empowering. If you're going to die anyway, if there's no cosmic scorekeeper judging your choices, if existence itself is a temporary gift with no strings attached, then you're free to live according to your deepest values rather than external expectations. The fear of death often paralyzes people into conformity, but existentialist philosophy suggests that mortality should have the opposite effect, liberating you to live authentically. This doesn't mean existentialists advocate for reckless hedonism or nihilistic destruction, quite the contrary. Because this life is all you have, because the meaning you create is the only meaning there is, every choice becomes supremely important. The existentialist lives with what Sartre called anguish, the weight of knowing that each decision shapes not only your own existence, but potentially influences the kind of world others will inherit. Stoicism and the art of dying. Well, while existentialists in 20th century Paris wrestled with creating meaning in an apparently meaningless universe, another philosophical tradition had been developing practical wisdom about mortality for over 2,000 years. Stoicism, founded in ancient Greece and refined in Rome, approaches death neither as illusion nor transformation nor absurd ending, but as the natural conclusion to a life lived according to virtue and reason. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his personal journal while campaigning on the frontiers of the Roman Empire, captured the Stoic attitude toward mortality with striking clarity. "Loss is nothing else but change," he wrote, "and change is nature's delight." For the Stoics, death wasn't an enemy to be feared or overcome, but simply the final movement in the natural order that governs all existence. This perspective flows from the Stoic understanding of the universe as a rational, ordered system where everything has its proper place and time. Just as individual notes contribute to a musical composition, individual lives contribute to the cosmic symphony. A note doesn't become less beautiful because it eventually ends. In fact, its beauty depends partly on its proper duration and timing. Similarly, a human life finds its meaning not in lasting forever, but in playing its part well for as long as it's meant to play. Seneca, perhaps the most practical of the Stoic philosophers, spent considerable time thinking about how to prepare for death in ways that would enhance rather than diminish daily living. He practiced what he called negative visualization, regularly imagining the loss of things he valued, including his own life. This wasn't morbid dwelling on tragedy, but training, designed to cultivate gratitude for what exists in the present moment, while reducing attachment to things that are ultimately beyond our control. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, Seneca observed. He encouraged his readers to think of each day as a complete life in miniature. You wake up as if being born, you live through various experiences and challenges, and you go to sleep as if dying. This daily practice of symbolic death and rebirth helps develop what Stoics consider the highest wisdom, understanding the difference between what is within your control and what isn't. Death, obviously, falls into the category of things beyond your control. You can't determine when it will come, how it will arrive, or what will happen afterward. But your response to mortality, your attitude toward the time you have and the choices you make while alive, these remain entirely within your power. The Stoic focuses energy exclusively on what can be influenced and accepts with equanimity what cannot be changed. This creates what Stoics call the discipline of desire. Instead of wanting things to be different than they are, including wanting to live longer than you're destined to live, you align your will with the natural order. This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Rather, it means channeling your energy into areas where you can actually make a difference, while accepting the framework within which that difference-making occurs. Epictetus, born a slave who became one of Rome's most respected philosophers, taught that freedom comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from understanding what truly belongs to you. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, he said, but in having few wants. This principle extends to life itself. True wealth consists not in having unlimited time, but in fully appreciating and wisely using whatever time you receive. The Stoic practice of memento mori, remembering death, serves a function similar to Buddhist impermanence meditation, but with a different emphasis. While Buddhists contemplate death to reduce attachment and understand the illusory nature of the self, Stoics remember mortality to clarify values and intensify commitment to virtue. Knowing that your time is limited helps you distinguish between what matters and what doesn't, between pursuits worthy of a rational being and mere distractions from living well. This leads to what might be called the Stoic paradox of death. By fully accepting mortality, by making peace with the fact that everything you build will eventually crumble and everyone you love will eventually die, you become more rather than less engaged with life. The energy that might otherwise be consumed to mortality becomes available for Thed by futile resistance work of living virtuously, creating beauty, and contributing to human flourishing. The Stoic approach to death also emphasizes what philosophers call the view from above. Marcus Aurelius regularly practiced imagining himself from the perspective of cosmic time and space, seeing his individual concerns against the backdrop of galaxies and geological ages. From this vantage point, the anxieties that normally consume daily attention reveal themselves as relatively insignificant, while the fundamental questions of character and virtue emerge as the only things truly worth caring about. This cosmic perspective doesn't diminish human life, but clarifies its proper significance. Your individual existence matters not because it will last forever, or because you're the center of the universe, but because you have the remarkable capacity for reason, virtue, and conscious participation in the rational order of things. Death ends this participation, but it doesn't negate the value of having participated authentically while you had the chance. Modern psychological research has validated many Stoic insights about mortality and well-being. Studies of post-traumatic growth show that people who face serious illness or other confrontations with mortality often report increased appreciation for life, clearer priorities, deeper relationships, and stronger sense of personal authenticity. The Stoic practices of accepting what cannot be controlled while focusing on what can be influenced appear to facilitate exactly this kind of positive adaptation to life's fundamental uncertainties. Yet as we survey these various philosophical approaches to death and meaning, we encounter perspectives that challenge even our basic assumptions about what death means and whether individual mortality is the whole story of human existence. The Platonic vision, death as awakening. In the shadowed corridors of ancient Athens, where Socrates once walked and questioned everything that seemed certain, his most famous student developed ideas about death that would illuminate human thought for millennia. Plato, sitting in the academy he founded among the olive groves outside the city, contemplated mortality not as an ending, but as the ultimate beginning, the moment when the soul finally breaks free from the prison of physical existence. The scene is timeless, an aging philosopher surrounded by eager students, Mediterranean sun filtering through leaves as he speaks of caves and shadows, of prisoners chained since birth who mistake flickering reflections on a wall for reality itself. But Plato's most profound insights emerge when he turns from metaphors to the direct question of what happens when consciousness encounters its own dissolution. For Plato, the body is merely a temporary vessel, a training ground where the immortal soul learns to recognize eternal truths. Death becomes not destruction, but liberation, the moment when pure consciousness sheds its material constraints and returns to the realm of perfect forms, perfect ideas, perfect beauty and truth that exist beyond the physical world's constant flux and decay. Consider how radically this reframes the entire question of mortality. Instead of life being a brief candle flickering in cosmic darkness, existence becomes an educational journey where death represents graduation rather than failure. The fears that typically accompany thoughts of dying dissolve when viewed from this perspective. You're not losing everything. You're finally gaining access to everything that physical existence prevented you from fully knowing. This vision emerges most clearly in Plato's account of Socrates' final hours, drinking hemlock while discussing the immortality of the soul with his grief-stricken friends. Socrates remains calm, even cheerful, because he understands death as the culmination of a life spent in philosophical preparation. Every moment of questioning assumptions, every effort to distinguish appearance from reality, every attempt to live according to wisdom rather than mere opinion has been practiced for this final transition. The philosophical life, in Plato's understanding, is essentially preparation for death, not in a morbid sense, but in the most practical way imaginable. Philosophy trains the mind to focus on eternal rather than temporal concerns, to value truth over pleasure, wisdom over wealth, virtue over reputation. These are precisely the capacities needed to navigate death successfully, to experience it as homecoming rather than exile. But Plato's vision extends beyond individual immortality to cosmic justice. The soul doesn't simply survive death, it carries forward the moral weight of choices made during physical existence. Actions have consequences that unfold across lifetimes, creating patterns of learning and development that continue until the soul achieves perfect wisdom and complete alignment with eternal truth. This creates what might be called the Platonic paradox of mortality. The more fully you accept that your true self transcends physical death, the more seriously you take the choices made during physical life. Every decision shapes the soul's trajectory. Every relationship provides opportunities for moral and spiritual development. Every challenge offers the possibility of growing closer to or further from ultimate reality. The practical implications ripple through every domain of human experience. Grief for the deceased becomes tempered by understanding that separation is temporary, that consciousness continues its journey even when physical presence ends. Fear of your own death diminishes when you recognize that what you truly are cannot be destroyed, only transformed and purified through the death experience itself. Yet this same perspective intensifies rather than diminishes ethical responsibility. If the soul is immortal, if choices have consequences beyond a single lifetime, then how you treat others and what kind of person you become matter more, not less, than they would in a purely materialist worldview. The temporary nature of physical existence makes it precious, but the eternal nature of consciousness makes it sacred. Plato's influence on subsequent thought about death and afterlife cannot be overstated. Christian, Islamic, and Jewish theology all bear traces of Platonic insights about soul immortality and divine justice. Even secular philosophies that reject literal afterlife beliefs often retain Platonic intuitions about the transcendent significance of human consciousness and moral choice. Modernalism, the readers sometimes struggle with Platonic to sharp separation between soul and body, mind and matter, eternal and temporal. Contemporary neuroscience suggests that consciousness emerges from rather than inhabits the brain, that mental phenomena are intimately connected to physical processes in ways that make soul immortality seem scientifically implausible. Yet, even if we interpret Plato's insights metaphorically rather than literally, they retain profound psychological and spiritual value. The idea that consciousness participates in something eternal, that individual existence connects to universal patterns of meaning and value, that death might represent transformation rather than termination. These possibilities continue to offer comfort and guidance to people facing mortality's mystery. Eastern perspectives. The Vedantic understanding. Beyond the philosophical gardens of Greece, in the ancient forests of India where seekers have pursued ultimate truth for thousands of years, another profound understanding of death and consciousness emerged. The Vedantic tradition, rooted in humanity's oldest spiritual texts, presents perhaps the most radical perspective on mortality ever conceived. That individual death is literally impossible because individual existence is ultimately an illusion. Picture the scene. A student approaches an elderly sage sitting beneath a banyan tree, its massive canopy providing shade from the scorching Indian sun. The student asks the question that has tormented humanity since consciousness first recognized its own mortality. What happens when I die? The sage smiles and responds with a question that changes everything. Who is this I that you think can die? This isn't wordplay or mystical obfuscation. The Vedantic analysis of consciousness leads to insights that quantum physicists and neuroscientists are only beginning to appreciate. What we normally think of as individual consciousness, the sense of being a separate self moving through time and space, is revealed through careful investigation to be a kind of optical illusion of awareness itself. The tradition teaches that ultimate reality, called Brahman, is pure consciousness without attributes, boundaries, or limitations. Individual beings are not separate from this consciousness, but temporary modifications of it, like waves arising from and dissolving back into an infinite ocean. The wave has apparent individuality while it exists, but its essential nature is always the water from which it's made. From this perspective, what we call death is simply the dissolution of a temporary pattern within eternal consciousness. The wave returns to the ocean, but the ocean itself remains unchanged. What seemed like individual existence was always just universal existence appearing to be individual through mind complexes. This understanding transforms the of identification with particular body, the mysterious power entire framework within which death is typically considered. Instead of being the termination of something precious and unique, death becomes the recognition of what was always true, that consciousness itself cannot die, that the very awareness is deathless, that what you truly are has never been born, and therefore reading these words right now is the same awareness that has looked Adi Shankara expressed through countless eyes throughout history. The Vedantic saged this insight with breathtaking clarity. Brahman alone is real. The world is appearance. The individual soul is nothing but Brahman itself. This isn't philosophical speculation, but the report of direct experience achieved through practices designed to dissolve the illusion of separation between observer and observed, between consciousness and its contents. The practical implications of this understanding are as profound as they are counterintuitive. If death is impossible because individual existence is illusory, then the entire project of trying to preserve or extend personal survival becomes irrelevant. Energy that might otherwise be consumed by mortality anxiety becomes available for the more fundamental work of recognizing what you truly are beyond all temporary identifications. This doesn't lead to nihilism or indifference toward human suffering. Quite the opposite. When the illusion of separation dissolves, compassion emerges naturally recognized as harming oneself, because harming others is normally created as helping oneself. The boundaries that helping others is understood ethical dilemmas disappear in the recognition of to death also includes is Sai's sophisticated understanding of the dying fundamental unity. The Vedantic approach gradually from the physical body, moving process itself. Consciousness through subtle states of awareness that can be navigated to withdraw aided skillfully by those who have prepared through meditation and study. Death becomes an opportunity for liberation rather than unconscious dissolution, a chance itself. Yet this tradition to recognize the Da acknowledges that most people die without achieving atlas nature of awareness this recognition, remaining identified with individual existence even as the body fails. In such cases, consciousness continues to create new identifications, new bodies, new lifetimes, until the lesson is finally learned and the illusion of separation is transcended once and for all. This cyclical view of existence, where consciousness moves achieving final liberation, provides a different kind of comfort than promises through countless births and deaths until of individual immortality. Instead, death and rebirth through unlimited consciousness itself. The transcendence of the ego's limitations, freedom of preserving the ego forever, it offers eventual recognition of one's true nature as quantum question, modern science from the entire cycle of birth and ancient wisdom. In the gleaming laboratories of modern physics, where scientists probe the fundamental nature of reality with instruments of extraordinary precision, discoveries are emerging wisdom traditions. The quantum mechanical understanding of consciousness that echo insights from the world's oldest in matter reveals a universe far stranger and more intercon exist in states. Profound questions about what death might actually mean. Consider the quantum measurement of superposition, simultaneously acted than classical physics ever imagined. Raising science, quantum systems problem, one of the deepest mysteries in modern embodying multiple possibilities until the moment of observation, when the wave function collapses into a single definite outcome. But what constitutes observation? What role does consciousness play in determining which possibility becomes actual reality? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness itself is fundamental to the universe's structure, not merely an emergent property of complex matter, but a basic feature of existence comparable to mass, energy, or electric charge. If consciousness is truly fundamental rather than derivative, then its relationship to physical death becomes radically uncertain. The physicist Max Planck, who pioneered quantum theory, made a startling observation. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. This perspective resonates remarkably with Vedantic insights about the primacy of consciousness, but it emerges from rigorous mathematical analysis rather than mystical experience. If consciousness is indeed fundamental to reality's structure, then the death of particular brains might not entail the cessation of consciousness itself, any more than the destruction of particular radio receivers would eliminate radio waves. Quantum entanglement presents another puzzle relevant to mortality and consciousness. Particles that have interacted remain mysteriously connected regardless of the distance separating them, with measurements of one particle instantly affecting the state of its entangled partner. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance, but experiments consistently confirm that quantum entanglement is real. If consciousness involves quantum processes, as some researchers suggest, then the connections between minds might persist in ways that transcend physical separation. The death of one person might not sever all connections with others who share deep relationships or profound experiences. Information and influence might continue flowing through quantum channels that remain active even after individual brains cease functioning. The physicist Amit Goswami proposes that consciousness is the ground of being from which material reality emerges through quantum processes. Individual of consciousness, temporary minds are like whirlpools in a stream, patterns that arise and dissolve while the underlying medium continues flowing. Death, from this perspective, is the dissolution of a particular pattern rather than the termination of consciousness itself. These scientific speculations remain highly controversial, and mainstream neuroscience continues to view consciousness as an emergent property of brain activity that necessarily ceases when neural processes stop. But the quantum perspective opens conceptual space for possibilities that materialist philosophy typically excludes, creating dialogue between ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science. The implications extend beyond theoretical physics into practical questions about how to live and die well. If consciousness is fundamental rather than derivative, if information can persist through quantum processes that transcend individual brains, if the connections between minds operate through channels that physical death cannot completely sever, then mortality takes on dimensions that purely materialist worldviews cannot accommodate. This doesn't provide easy answers or definitive comfort, but it does suggest that the question of what happens after death remains genuinely open rather than definitively settled. The universe revealed by quantum mechanics is far more mysterious and interconnected than classical science assumed, leaving room for possibilities that neither dogmatic materialism nor traditional religion adequately addresses. The phenomenology of dying, what the experience reveals. In quiet hospice rooms around the world, where people face their final days with varying degrees of peace or struggle, patterns emerge that illuminate the dying process from the inside. Medical professionals, Spiritual counselors and family members who spend time with the dying report experiences that challenge conventional assumptions about consciousness, death, and what might lie beyond physical existence. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who pioneered the modern understanding of death and dying, spent decades listening to patients describe their experiences as they approached death. What she discovered was a remarkably consistent pattern of psychological and spiritual development that often transformed people's understanding of mortality itself. Many dying patients report experiences of unusual clarity and peace in their final days or hours, as if approaching death removes barriers to deeper levels of awareness. Pain and fear often diminish, replaced by a sense of completion and readiness to let go. Some describe visions of deceased loved ones coming to guide them through the transition, experiences so vivid and consistent that they challenge purely neurological explanations. Near-death experiences, reported by people who have been clinically dead but subsequently revived, provide another window into consciousness during the dying process. Despite skeptical explanations involving oxygen deprivation or brain chemistry changes, these experiences show remarkable consistency across cultures and individuals. The sense of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel of light, encountering beings of profound love and wisdom, experiencing life review, and ultimately choosing to return to physical existence. Dr. Raymond Moody, who coined the term near-death experience, has collected thousands of such accounts. While he remains scientifically cautious about their ultimate meaning, he observes that people who have these experiences typically lose their fear of death completely and report profound positive changes in their values and relationships. Whatever's happening during these episodes, the psychological and spiritual effects appear to be consistently beneficial. The phenomenology of dying also includes reports from caregivers and family members who witness the death process. Many describe sensing the moment when consciousness leaves the body, often accompanied by subtle changes in the room's atmosphere or unusual phenomena that resist easy explanation. Skeptics attribute these experiences to grief-induced projection, but their consistency across diverse populations suggests something more complex might be occurring. Recent research into consciousness during cardiac arrest has produced intriguing findings. Some patients report detailed awareness of events occurring, while their brains showed no measurable activity, including conversations and procedures they should not have been able to perceive. While these cases remain controversial, they raise questions about the relationship between consciousness and brain function during the dying process. The hospice movement has also revealed how the approach to death affects the dying process itself. People who die surrounded by love, acceptance, and spiritual support typically experience more peaceful transitions than those who die in fear, denial, or isolation. The quality of consciousness during dying appears to influence the experience profoundly, suggesting that preparation for death through meditation, prayer, or philosophical reflection might have practical as well as theoretical value. These phenomenological investigations don't prove any particular theory about death and afterlife, but they do suggest that the dying process involves dimensions of experience that purely biological approaches might overlook. Whether interpreted through materialist, spiritual, or quantum frameworks, the consistent reports of expanded awareness, transcendent peace, and connection to something beyond individual existence during dying deserve serious consideration from anyone seeking to understand mortality's full significance. The patterns observed in dying experiences also influence how we might approach living. If consciousness during death often involves life review, where the moral and spiritual significance of choices becomes crystal clear, then the ethical implications of daily decisions take on greater weight. If approaching death typically brings clarity about what matters most in human existence, then cultivating that clarity while healthy becomes a form of preparation for both living and dying well. The therapeutic power of mortality awareness. In the gentle quiet of a counseling room, where afternoon light filters through blinds and creates patterns on the wall, a curious phenomenon emerges when people begin to explore their relationship with death. Rather than increasing anxiety as one might expect, honest confrontation with mortality often produces the opposite effect. The therapeutic community has discovered that facing death directly can become one of the most powerful tools for psychological healing and authentic living. Terror management theory, developed by psychologists building on the insights of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, suggests that much of human behavior stems from unconscious death anxiety. We create elaborate cultural meanings, pursue status and achievement, and lose ourselves in busyness partly to avoid confronting the fundamental terror of our finite existence. Yeah, this avoidance, while understandable, often leads to the very suffering it seeks to prevent. Consider the middle-aged executive who works 80-hour weeks, accumulating wealth and status in a desperate attempt to feel secure and significant. Beneath his driven behavior lies an unexamined fear that without constant achievement, his existence lacks meaning. The anxiety he experiences isn't really about quarterly reports or competitor threats, but about the deeper question of whether his life matters in the face of inevitable death. When such individuals are guided to explore their mortality directly, something remarkable often happens. The artificial urgency that drives compulsive achievement begins to dissolve. Energy previously consumed by status competition becomes available for activities that provide genuine satisfaction. Relationships deepen because time together is recognized as precious rather than taken for granted. The fear of death, when faced honestly, often reveals itself as less terrifying than the unconscious anxiety of avoiding it. Dr. Irvin Yalom, one of the most respected figures in existential psychotherapy, has spent decades helping people confront what he calls the ultimate concerns of human existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. His therapeutic approach involves creating safe space for clients to explore their mortality anxiety without the usual defenses and distractions. What emerges from this process is often profound personal transformation. Yalom describes working with a woman who had spent years in traditional therapy, addressing her depression and relationship difficulties without lasting improvement. When they began exploring her underlying terror of death, she suddenly understood the source of her chronic anxiety and compulsive people-pleasing. She had been trying to ensure that others would remember her fondly, unconsciously believing that positive memories could somehow protect her from mortality. Once this pattern became conscious, she could begin making choices based on her authentic values rather than fear-driven attempts to secure symbolic immortality. The therapeutic power of mortality awareness extends beyond individual psychology into the realm of meaning-making. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, observed that people can endure almost any suffering if they can find meaning in it. But meaning, he argued, cannot be pursued directly. It emerges as a byproduct of commitment to something larger than oneself, and this commitment becomes most authentic when undertaken with full awareness of life's finite nature. Frankl's logotherapy, based on his experiences in Nazi concentration camps, demonstrates how confronting the possibility of death can clarify what makes life worth living. When external security is stripped away, when the normal sources of meaning are destroyed, what remains is the irreducible freedom to choose one's attitude toward whatever circumstances arise. This freedom becomes most apparent and most powerful when exercised in the face of mortality. Modern grief counseling has incorporated similar insights about the relationship between death awareness and authentic living. People who have lost loved ones often report that their grief, while painful, has taught them to appreciate life more fully. The confrontation with another's mortality breaks through the illusion that time is unlimited, creating urgency about expressing love, pursuing meaningful goals, and living according to deeply held values. This phenomenon appears in various therapeutic contexts. Cancer patients frequently describe how their diagnosis, despite its trauma, led to positive life changes they wouldn't have made otherwise. Soldiers returning from war often report that witnessing death gave them clarity about what truly matters in civilian life. People who survive accidents or natural disasters commonly experience what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, emerging from their brush with mortality, with deeper appreciation for existence itself. The therapeutic community has also discovered that mortality awareness can transform the relationship to anxiety and depression. When people understand that their time is limited, many of the concerns that typically generate psychological distress begin to appear less significant. The opinion of strangers matters less when you recognize that all human judgments are temporary. Social embarrassment feels less catastrophic when viewed against the backdrop of mortality. Even failure loses some of its sting when understood as a natural part of finite existence. But perhaps, most importantly, direct engagement with mortality often produces what therapists call existential courage, the willingness to live authentically despite uncertainty about ultimate meaning or purpose. This courage doesn't eliminate the anxiety that comes with being human, but it transforms that anxiety from paralyzing terror into creative tension that motivates meaningful action. The process isn't easy, and it's not appropriate for everyone at every moment. People in acute psychological crisis may need stabilization before they can safely explore mortality themes. But for those ready to engage with these ultimate concerns, the therapeutic benefits can be profound and lasting. The fear of death, when met with compassionate awareness rather than desperate avoidance, often reveals itself as a teacher rather than an enemy. Death in dreams and the unconscious mind. In the mysterious realm of sleep, where consciousness ventures beyond the boundaries of waking logic, death appears with remarkable frequency and symbolic richness. Dream researchers have long observed that mortality themes emerge in the unconscious mind of virtually every human being, often carrying messages about psychological transformation that extend far beyond literal concerns about dying. Carl Jung, the pioneering depth psychologist, viewed death dreams not as omens of actual mortality but as symbols of psychological transformation. In the language of the unconscious, death often represents the ending of one phase of existence to make room for something new to emerge. The dream ego that dies might represent an outdated way of being, a limiting belief system, or an identity that no longer serves the dreamer's growth. Consider the common dream of witnessing one's own funeral. Rather than predicting actual death, such dreams often occur during major life transitions, when the dreamer is unconsciously preparing to leave behind familiar patterns and embrace unknown possibilities. The college student dreaming of her own death might be symbolically burying her adolescent identity to make room for adult selfhood. The recently divorced person witnessing their funeral might be mourning the death of their married identity while preparing for rebirth as a single individual. Jung observed that death dreams frequently appear during what he called the midlife transition, when people naturally begin confronting their mortality more directly. These dreams serve a compensatory function, balancing conscious attitudes that might be avoiding necessary psychological development. The executive who dreams of dying might be receiving an unconscious message about the need to let go of workaholic patterns that are killing his capacity for intimacy and joy. The symbolic language of death dreams often reveals sophisticated psychological wisdom. Dreams of dead relatives frequently occur when the dreamer is facing challenges that require qualities the deceased person embodied. A woman dreaming of her deceased grandmother might be unconsciously accessing the elder's strength and resilience during her own difficult period. The dead relative in the dream often provides guidance or comfort, suggesting that psychological resources associated with that person remain available even after their physical death. Freud interpreted death dreams differently, viewing them through the lens of repressed wishes and unconscious conflicts. In his framework, dreaming of someone's death might represent unconscious hostility toward that person, while dreaming of one's own death could reflect self-punishment for unacceptable impulses. While modern dream research has moved beyond Freud's more literal interpretations, his insights about the unconscious processing of mortality remain valuable. Contemporary neuroscience offers another perspective on death dreams. During REM sleep, the brain processes emotional experiences and memories, integrating them into existing neural networks. Death dreams might represent the mind's attempt to process mortality anxiety and develop psychological resources for coping with loss. The emotional intensity of these dreams often helps consolidate learning about grief, acceptance, and the preciousness of life. Cultural anthropologists have documented the universal appearance of death themes in human dreams across all known societies. This universality suggests that confronting mortality through dream symbolism serves essential psychological functions that transcend cultural differences. The specific symbols vary between cultures, but the underlying process of using death imagery to represent transformation appears to be fundamental to human psychology. Lucid dreamers, who become conscious while dreaming and can direct their dream experiences, often report profound encounters with death symbolism. Some describe deliberately seeking death in dreams as a way of exploring their mortality anxiety in a safe environment. Others report spontaneous death experiences in lucid dreams that produce lasting changes in their waking attitudes toward mortality. The therapeutic community has developed techniques for working with death dreams constructively. Rather than dismissing them as mere anxiety symptoms, therapists trained in dream work help clients explore the transformative messages these dreams might contain. The nightmare about being chased by death might be reframed as an invitation to stop running from necessary change. The dream of a deceased loved one might be explored for the ongoing psychological relationship the dreamer maintains with that person's memory and influence. Sleep researchers have also discovered that people approaching actual death often experience dreams with distinctive characteristics. These pre-death dreams frequently involve deceased loved ones welcoming the dreamer, scenes of travel or departure, or imagery of light and transcendence. Unlike typical anxiety dreams, these experiences are usually peaceful and comforting, suggesting that the unconscious mind may possess resources for preparing consciousness for the dying process. The study of death dreams reveals the unconscious mind's remarkable capacity for psychological healing and growth. Rather than being sources of terror, these dreams often serve as invitations to embrace necessary transformations, process grief and loss, and develop deeper appreciation for the gift of conscious existence. They remind us that, even in sleep, the psyche continues its essential work of helping us navigate the fundamental realities of mortal existence. Studying the philosophy of grief and mourning. In the raw moments following loss, when the reality of another's death first penetrates consciousness, we encounter grief not merely as emotion, but as philosophical teacher. The experience of mourning strips away comfortable assumptions about existence, relationships, and meaning, forcing confrontation with questions that abstract philosophical discussion can never fully address. What does it mean to love someone who no longer exists? How do we understand our own identity when defined partly through relationships that death has severed? The philosopher Thomas Nagel observed that death poses what he called the problem of the subject. When someone dies, what exactly has been lost? The physical body remains temporarily, but the conscious being who inhabited that body has vanished completely. The personality, memories, hopes, and fears that made the person unique have disappeared, leaving behind only traces in the minds of survivors. Grief emerges partly from the struggle to comprehend this metaphysical mystery. Different philosophical traditions offer varying frameworks for understanding grief's meaning and purpose. The Stoics viewed mourning as natural, but potentially excessive, arguing that prolonged grief represents attachment to things beyond our control. Seneca, writing to comfort a friend who had lost his son, acknowledged the legitimacy of initial sorrow while warning against allowing grief to become a permanent condition that prevents continued engagement with life. Yet the Stoic approach, while offering practical wisdom about acceptance and emotional regulation, may miss something essential about grief's philosophical significance. Contemporary thinkers like Thomas Hill suggest that grief serves as testimony to the irreplaceable value of individual relationships. To mourn deeply is to affirm that the deceased person mattered uniquely, that their existence created value that cannot be substituted or replaced by other relationships. This perspective transforms grief from mere emotional reaction into moral statement. The depth of our mourning reflects the depth of our love, and the depth of our love reflects our recognition of another person's irreducible worth. Shallow grief might indicate shallow relationships, while profound mourning testifies to profound connection. The person who claims to accept death easily without significant grief might be revealing more about their capacity for love than their philosophical sophistication. The temporality of grief also raises philosophical questions about memory, identity, and the nature of human relationships. How long should mourning last? When does healthy grief become pathological, clinging to the past? Different cultures provide varying answers, from brief mourning periods that emphasize the need for survivors to continue living, to extended bereavement rituals that honor the ongoing significance of the deceased. Modern psychology has developed stage theories of grief, suggesting that mourning follows predictable patterns of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. But philosophers question whether grief should be understood as problem to be solved or process to be completed. Perhaps mourning represents not temporary disruption of normal functioning, but ongoing dimension of human existence that deepens rather than diminishes over time. The phenomenology of grief reveals aspects of human consciousness that normal experience keeps hidden. In mourning, we discover how thoroughly our sense of self depends on relationships with others. The widow who says, "I don't know who I am anymore," isn't speaking metaphorically, but describing literal truth about identity's relational nature. Decades of shared experience, mutual influence, and intertwined daily routines create psychological structures that death dismantles suddenly and completely. This relational understanding of identity has implications for how we understand our own mortality. If the self is partly constituted through relationships with others, then aspects of who we are survive in the memories, habits, and continuing influence we have on those who knew us. The deceased person lives on not through supernatural continuation, but through psychological integration into survivors' ongoing existence. Yet this perspective raises troubling questions about the deaths of people who leave no survivors to remember them. Does the homeless person who dies alone have less claim to significance than the beloved family member whose death creates widespread mourning? The philosophical challenge of grief extends beyond personal loss to questions about the value and meaning of all human existence. Some philosophers find in grief evidence for what might be called the moral significance of particularity. Universal love or compassion, while admirable, cannot replace the specific love we feel for specific individuals. The universalist who claims to love all humanity equally has never truly loved anyone, because love requires recognition of irreplaceable uniqueness. Grief teaches us that persons are not interchangeable units, but unique centers of experience, whose loss creates gaps that cannot be filled. The social dimensions of grief also reveal philosophical insights about human nature and community. Mourning rituals serve not only to comfort survivors, but to affirm collective values about life's meaning and death's significance. The funeral ceremony declares that individual existence matters to the community, that death represents genuine loss rather than mere biological event, that memory and honor deserve public expression. Different grief traditions embody different philosophical assumptions about death's meaning. The Irish wake celebrates the deceased person's life while acknowledging death's reality. The Jewish Shiva provides structured time for mourning while emphasizing the continuation of life. The Buddhist approach to grief seeks to balance compassion for survivors with detachment from impermanent phenomena. Perhaps the deepest philosophical insight grief provides concerns the relationship between love and mortality. To love fully requires accepting vulnerability to loss. The person who protects themselves from grief by avoiding deep attachments also protects themselves from love's transformative power. The risk of mourning is the price of meaningful relationship, and the willingness to pay that price reflects commitment to values that transcend self-protection. In this light, grief becomes not merely unfortunate consequence of mortal existence, but essential dimension of what makes life meaningful. The capacity to mourn deeply indicates the capacity to love deeply, and the capacity to love deeply indicates participation in what philosophers across traditions have identified as existence's highest possibility. Children and death, developing mortality, awareness. In the pristine world of childhood, where scraped knees seem like major tragedies and summer days stretch toward infinity, the gradual awakening to mortality represents one of the most profound developmental transitions human beings experience. Child psychologists and philosophers have long studied how young minds first encounter death, and what this encounter reveals about consciousness, time, and the nature of human understanding itself. The Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget observed that children's comprehension of death develops in predictable stages corresponding to their broader cognitive development. Very young children, typically under 5, often understand death as temporary and reversible, like sleep or a trip to another place. They might ask when the dead person will wake up or come back home, revealing their inability to grasp the permanent, irreversible nature of mortality. This early confusion about death's finality isn't simply ignorance that education can easily correct. It reflects fundamental features of childhood consciousness. Young children live in an eternal present where yesterday and tomorrow have little psychological reality. The concept of permanent ending requires abstract thinking about time that develops gradually through experience and neurological maturation. Between ages 5 and 7, most children begin understanding death's universality, permanence, and inevitability. They realize that all living things die, that death cannot be undone, and that they too will someday face this experience. This developmental milestone often coincides with what child psychologists call mortality salience, increased awareness of death that can produce anxiety, questioning, and sometimes behavioral changes. The philosopher and educator John Dewey argued that children's first encounters with death represent crucial opportunities for developing philosophical thinking. When a child asks, "What happens when we die?" or "Why do people have to die?" they're engaging with ultimate questions that have occupied human thought for millennia. How adults respond to these inquiries can either encourage or discourage the child's natural philosophical curiosity. Cultural anthropologists have documented enormous variation in how different societies introduce children to mortality concepts. Some cultures include children in death rituals from early ages, viewing exposure to mortality as essential for psychological and spiritual development. Others shelter children from death experiences, believing that premature exposure to mortality can cause trauma or anxiety disorders. The child's first personal encounter with death, whether through the loss of a pet, grandparent, or other loved one, often serves as a defining moment in psychological development. Researchers studying childhood grief have found that these early experiences of loss can shape attitudes toward mortality, relationships, and life meaning that persist into adulthood. Children who receive honest, age-appropriate explanations about death, along with emotional support for processing their grief, typically develop healthier attitudes toward mortality than those who are protected from or lied to about death's reality. The common adult impulse to tell children that deceased loved ones have gone to sleep or taken a trip can create more anxiety than comfort, as children may develop fears about sleeping or traveling. The developmental psychologist Maria Nagy conducted groundbreaking research on children's death concepts by asking hundreds of children to draw pictures and tell stories about death. Her findings revealed the remarkable creativity young minds bring to mortality questions. Children often personify death as a character or creature, imagine elaborate afterlife scenarios, or develop unique theories about what happens to consciousness after bodily death. These childhood philosophies of death, while often scientifically inaccurate, frequently contain profound insights about existence's mystery and meaning. The 6-year-old who decides that dead people become stars, watching over the living, has created a worldview that addresses needs for comfort, continuity, and cosmic significance. The 8-year-old who worries about whether deceased pets remember their human families is grappling seriously with questions about consciousness and memory that professional philosophers still debate. Educational philosophers have argued for including mortality education in school curricula, not to frighten children but to help them develop healthy frameworks for understanding life's finite nature. Such programs might use literature, art, and discussion to explore death themes in developmentally appropriate ways, helping children process their natural curiosity about mortality while building emotional resilience. The child's developing understanding of death also intersects with their moral development. Learning that actions have consequences that can be permanent, that some forms of harm cannot be undone, that life is precious partly because it is fragile, these realizations contribute to the emergence of ethical thinking and empathetic concern for others. Children's questions about death often reveal philosophical sophistication that adults underestimate. When a 4-year-old asks whether dead people dream, they're exploring the relationship between consciousness and bodily existence. When a 7-year-old wonders whether death hurts, they're investigating the connection between physical and experiential reality. These inquiries deserve serious engagement rather than dismissive reassurance. The way children process mortality also illuminates broader questions about human nature and development. Why do young children seem naturally drawn to death themes in fairy tales and stories? Why do they often show less fear of death than adults, sometimes expressing curiosity or acceptance that their elders find disturbing? These patterns suggest that mortality awareness might be more fundamental to human psychology than we typically recognize. Perhaps most significantly, observing children encounter death reminds adults of the wonder and mystery that surround mortality questions. Children approach death with the same curiosity they bring to other aspects of existence, unburdened by the anxiety and avoidance that often characterize adult attitudes toward mortality. Their fresh perspectives can help adults rediscover the philosophical richness hidden within questions that familiarity has made seem routine or frightening. The child's journey toward understanding death represents not just individual development, but participation in humanity's ongoing attempt to comprehend existence's deepest mysteries. In watching children grapple with mortality, we witness the eternal human quest for meaning playing out in its most pure and undefended form. Time, memory, and the persistence of the dead. In the flowing stream of temporal existence, where moments arise and dissolve with relentless consistency, the dead occupy a peculiar position that challenges our normal understanding of presence and absence. Though their bodies have returned to dust and their consciousness has ceased its familiar patterns, the deceased continue to exert influence, provide comfort, and shape reality in ways that purely materialist philosophy struggles to explain. Consider the phenomenon of continuing bonds discovered by grief researchers who challenged earlier assumptions about the necessity of letting go of the deceased. Rather than severing emotional connections with dead loved ones, many bereaved individuals maintain ongoing relationships through memory, imagination, and symbolic interaction that can provide guidance and comfort for years or even decades after death. The widower who still sets two places at the dinner table isn't necessarily displaying pathological denial of loss. He may be honoring a relationship that death has transformed but not eliminated. The mother who continues conversations with her deceased child isn't necessarily avoiding grief's necessary work. She may be accessing a form of connection that transcends physical presence while acknowledging its changed nature. This persistence of relationship beyond death raises profound questions about the nature of time and memory. In linear time, the past is gone, the future hasn't arrived, and only the present moment truly exists. But psychological time operates differently. Memory allows past experiences to become present realities, while anticipation makes future possibilities psychologically available. The dead exist in memory as vividly as living people exist in physical space. The philosopher Henri Bergson argued that memory isn't simply storage of past experiences, but active reconstruction of the past within present consciousness. When we remember deceased loved ones, we're not accessing static recordings, but creatively rebuilding their presence using current psychological resources. This creative aspect of memory helps explain why relationships with the dead can continue evolving even after death has occurred. The dead shape present reality through what might be called temporal presence. The decisions they made during life continue producing consequences that unfold across subsequent generations. The values they taught continue influencing the choices of survivors. The institutions they built continue serving functions they envisioned. The books they wrote continue communicating ideas to readers they never met. This temporal presence operates independently of supernatural beliefs about consciousness survival. Whether or not individual awareness persists after death, individual influence certainly does. The patterns of causation set in motion during life continue propagating through natural processes that death cannot interrupt. Every action creates ripples that spread far beyond the actor's lifetime, creating a form of immortality that requires no metaphysical assumptions. The phenomenon of inherited trauma illustrates how the dead can influence the living through mechanisms that operate below conscious awareness. Children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, for instance, often display psychological patterns that reflect their ancestors' experiences despite never having directly encountered the traumatic events. The dead's unresolved pain can become the living's unconscious burden, creating continuity of experience across generations. But this temporal connection between living and dead also enables positive transmission of wisdom, resilience, and love. The grandchild who displays courage in facing adversity may be accessing psychological resources inherited from ancestors who demonstrated similar courage under different circumstances. Family traditions, cultural practices, and moral values create channels through which the dead continue contributing to the living's flourishing. The role of ritual in maintaining connections with the deceased reveals another dimension of temporal presence. Memorial services, anniversary observances, and graveside visits create structured opportunities for accessing relationships with the dead. These rituals don't require belief in supernatural communication to serve important psychological and social functions. Through ritual, the dead are given continuing roles in family and community life. The deceased grandparent whose birthday is still celebrated remains psychologically present as source of family identity and continuity. The honored war veteran whose memorial service draws hundreds of attendees continues serving as symbol of sacrifice and civic virtue. The beloved teacher whose former students gather annually to share memories continues influencing educational practice through ongoing inspiration. The persistence of the dead also operates through cultural memory, where collective rather than individual relationships with deceased persons continue shaping social reality. Historical figures long dead continue influencing contemporary politics, art, science, and philosophy through their recorded ideas and documented achievements. Shakespeare's influence on literature hasn't diminished despite his death over 4 centuries ago. Einstein's contributions to physics remain active forces in ongoing scientific development. This cultural immortality raises questions about what aspects of human existence are most likely to persist beyond individual death. Physical beauty fades quickly. Wealth transfers to heirs. Social status disappears with changing circumstances. But ideas, artistic creations, and moral examples can maintain their power across centuries or even millennia. The pursuit of cultural immortality through creative work and ethical living represents one response to mortality that doesn't require supernatural beliefs. The digital age has created new forms of persistence for the dead. Social media profiles remain active after their creators' deaths, continuing to receive messages from friends and family members. Digital archives preserve vast quantities of personal information, correspondence, and creative work that previous generations would have lost to time. These technological developments raise novel questions about the relationship between individual identity and digital traces. Yet even as technology creates new possibilities for preserving traces of the dead, the fundamental questions about consciousness and personal identity remain unresolved. Does the digital preservation of someone's thoughts, preferences, and communication patterns constitute a form of survival or merely sophisticated record-keeping? If artificial intelligence eventually becomes capable of simulating deceased persons based on their digital traces, would such simulations represent genuine continuation or elaborate illusion? The persistence of the dead through time, memory, and continuing influence demonstrates that mortality's significance extends far beyond individual experience of dying. Death marks the end of biological functioning and conscious awareness, but it doesn't mark the end of individual significance or relational connection. The dead continue inhabiting the world of the living through mechanisms both obvious and subtle, creating forms of immortality that transcend both materialist dismissal and supernatural speculation. The Art of Dying, Lessons from the Deathbed. In the hushed corridors of hospitals worldwide, where the fluorescent lights cast their sterile glow and the quiet beeping of machines marks the rhythm of fading lives, something remarkable occurs. Those who work closely with the dying, hospice nurses, chaplains, physicians who specialize in end-of-life care, report witnessing transformations so profound they challenge everything we think we know about death's meaning. Dr. Sarah Chen has spent 15 years as a palliative care physician, sitting bedside with thousands of people in their final days. What she's observed has convinced her that the process of dying itself might be humanity's most undervalued teacher. People arrive at death's threshold carrying the full weight of their accumulated fears, she explains, her voice soft with a wisdom earned through countless vigils. But something happens in those final days or hours. The fears that seemed so enormous suddenly become transparent. It's as if approaching death strips away everything inauthentic, leaving only what truly matters. This phenomenon appears across cultures, backgrounds, and belief systems with stunning consistency. The businessman who spent decades chasing quarterly profits finds himself speaking only of relationships in his final conversations. The social media influencer with millions of followers discovers that fame feels meaningless when measured against the simple presence of a loved one holding her hand. The academic who built his identity around intellectual achievement lets go of complex theories to rest in wordless peace. What these deathbed revelations suggest is that mortality awareness doesn't just change how we think about dying, it transforms how we understand living. The proximity of death seems to activate a different kind of intelligence, one that can distinguish instantly between authentic and artificial sources of meaning. This intelligence doesn't emerge from philosophical study or spiritual practice, but from the simple recognition that time is running out. Consider the case of Michael, a retired engineer who had lived his entire adult life according to careful plans and calculated risks. When diagnosed with pancreatic cancer at 72, he initially approached his illness the same way he had approached engineering problems, gathering data, consulting experts, optimizing treatment protocols. But as his condition progressed and cure became impossible, something shifted. The man who had never spoken openly about emotions began telling his adult children exactly how much he loved them. The husband who had taken his wife's presence for granted started expressing daily gratitude for 47 years of marriage. The father who had been too busy for grandchildren's games suddenly found infinite patience for bedtime stories. It wasn't that I became a different person, Michael explained during one of his final interviews. It was more like I finally became myself. All the stuff I thought was important, the projects, the achievements, the worries about money, they just fell away. What remained was what had always been most important, but I'd been too distracted to notice. This pattern of clarification appears so regularly in dying experiences that some philosophers have suggested death awareness might be essential for authentic living. The prospect of mortality strips away the luxury of infinite delay. When time becomes obviously limited, the question, what matters most, demands immediate attention rather than indefinite postponement. The wisdom traditions have long recognized this connection between death awareness and authentic existence. The medieval Christian practice of memento mori, remember you must die, wasn't intended to create morbid preoccupation but to maintain perspective on life's temporary nature. The Islamic teaching that believers should remember death frequently aims to keep worldly attachments in proper proportion. The Hindu understanding of life as preparation for death emphasizes the importance of spiritual development, while physical existence allows such growth. But you don't need religious framework to benefit from mortality awareness. Modern psychology has documented how confronting death directly can produce what researchers call post-traumatic growth, positive psychological changes that emerge from facing life-threatening circumstances. People who have genuine encounters with mortality often report increased appreciation for life, clearer priorities, deeper relationships, and stronger sense of personal authenticity. The neuroscientist Dr. Eben Alexander experienced this transformation firsthand when a rare brain infection left him in a week-long coma. His account of the experience, while controversial in its spiritual interpretations, illustrates the psychological shift that often accompanies close encounters with death. Before my illness, I was completely identified with my professional role, my intellectual achievements, my social status, he reflects. Coming back from that experience, those identities felt like costumes I had been wearing. What felt real was love, connection, and the simple miracle of conscious existence itself. This stripping away of artificial identities in the face of mortality points toward what existential philosophers call authentic being. When death becomes real, rather than abstract, when the end of personal existence shifts from distant possibility to immediate prospect, many people discover capacities for presence, gratitude, and love that had been buried under layers of social conditioning and psychological defense. The hospice movement has institutionalized this wisdom, creating environments where dying can become a conscious process rather than medical failure. In the best hospice care, death isn't fought against as enemy, but accepted as natural transition that can be navigated with dignity, consciousness, and even growth. Patients often report that their final weeks or months become among the most meaningful of their entire lives, not despite their approaching death, but because of it. On the question of continuity, what survives death? As we move deeper into the philosophical landscape of mortality, we encounter perhaps the most enduring question human consciousness has ever posed. What, if anything, persists beyond the threshold of physical death? This inquiry has occupied minds across every culture and historical period, generating responses that range from confident assertions of individual immortality to equally confident declarations of complete annihilation. The complexity of this question becomes apparent when we consider what we mean by survival. Are we asking whether consciousness continues? Whether personal identity persists? Whether information or influence extends beyond bodily death? Whether the patterns that constitute individual existence maintain some form of coherence after biological processes cease? Each variation of the question opens different philosophical territories and suggests different investigative approaches. The materialist position, dominant in contemporary academic philosophy and neuroscience, holds that consciousness emerges from complex arrangements of matter and energy within the brain. When neural activity stops permanently, consciousness simply ceases to exist. There's no survival because there's nothing to survive except temporary patterns of physical activity that death necessarily terminates. This view offers clarity and consistency with scientific understanding of brain function, but it struggles to account for the persistent sense many people have that something essential about human existence transcends physical processes. The philosopher Daniel Dennett, one of materialism's most articulate defenders, argues that the self we imagine surviving death is itself an illusion. What we call personal identity is really a collection of memories, habits, and responses that create the narrative fiction of continuous selfhood. When the brain stops creating this narrative, the self doesn't go somewhere else, it simply stops being constructed. There's no more mystery to death than there is to the ending of a song or the conclusion of a story. Yet, even within materialist frameworks, questions of continuity remain complex. The information patterns that constitute memory, personality, and individual characteristics don't disappear instantaneously at death. They persist in the brains of other people who knew the deceased, in written records, in cultural influences, in genetic material passed to offspring. These forms of persistence don't constitute personal survival in any conscious sense, but they do represent genuine continuity of pattern and influence across the boundary of individual death. The information theorist and philosopher Susan Schneider has explored how understanding consciousness in terms of information processing might affect questions of survival. If consciousness is fundamentally about information integration and processing, then the question becomes whether these informational patterns could theoretically persist or be reconstructed through non-biological means. While such possibilities remain scientifically speculative, they illustrate how even materialist approaches to consciousness can generate surprising perspectives on survival questions. Religious and spiritual traditions typically offer more robust claims about post-mortem continuity. Christianity promises resurrection of the body and eternal life for souls that accept divine salvation. Islam teaches that consciousness continues after death in states of reward or punishment corresponding to earthly behavior. Hinduism describes consciousness as essentially eternal, moving through cycles of embodiment until achieving final liberation from the material realm. These traditions don't just assert survival, but provide detailed maps of post-mortem existence. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes intermediate states between death and rebirth where consciousness navigates various challenges and opportunities. Christian theology distinguishes between immediate post-mortem existence of the soul and ultimate resurrection of transformed physical bodies. Islamic teaching describes specific stages of afterlife experience corresponding to individual spiritual development during earthly existence. But religious claims about survival face philosophical challenges that have occupied theologians for centuries. If personal identity depends on memory, and if memories are stored in brains that decompose after death, how can individual identity persist in afterlife states? If consciousness requires physical processes, how can it function without material substrate? If survival involves judgment based on earthly actions, how can infinite punishment be justified for finite sins? Different religious traditions have developed sophisticated responses to these challenges. The concept of the soul provides a non-physical substrate for consciousness that can survive bodily death. The doctrine of resurrection promises that individual identity will be restored through divine recreation of appropriate physical forms. The teaching of karma suggests that post-mortem experiences unfold according to natural law rather than arbitrary judgment. Yet, even among religious believers, questions remain about the nature and desirability of survival. Would eternal existence eventually become boring or oppressive? Would individual identity remain meaningful across infinite time? Would consciousness maintain its essential characteristics without the limitations and vulnerabilities that seem to define human experience? These questions challenge believers to clarify what they actually hope for in survival, and what would make post-mortem existence worthwhile. Some philosophical approaches attempt to navigate between materialist denial and religious assertion by reconceptualizing what survival might mean. The process philosopher Alfred North Whitehead suggested that individual experiences become permanently preserved in what he called the consequent nature of God, a cosmic memory that ensures nothing of value is ever truly lost. This view offers a form of immortality that doesn't require individual consciousness to persist, but does guarantee that the significance of each life becomes part of eternal reality. The panpsychist tradition, which attributes consciousness to all matter, opens space for thinking about death as transformation rather than termination. If consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality rather than an emergent property of complex brains, then death might involve the redistribution or reorganization of conscious elements rather than their complete elimination. The patterns that constitute individual awareness dissolve, but the conscious substrate from which they emerged continues in new configurations. Contemporary discussions of survival often invoke quantum mechanical concepts like entanglement and information preservation. Some researchers speculate that consciousness might involve quantum processes that could theoretically persist beyond biological death through mechanisms we don't yet understand. While such speculations remain scientifically unproven, they illustrate how advances in physics might eventually reshape philosophical discussions of survival. The near-death experience literature provides another perspective on continuity questions. Thousands of people report maintaining consciousness during clinical death, experiencing encounters with deceased relatives, and receiving information they couldn't have acquired through normal sensory channels. Skeptics explain these reports through neurological processes associated with brain shutdown, but the consistency and transformative impact of such experiences suggest they deserve serious philosophical consideration, regardless of their ultimate explanation. Perhaps the most honest philosophical position acknowledges that survival questions push beyond the limits of what finite minds can definitively answer. We lack direct access to post-mortem states, and the nature of consciousness itself remains deeply mysterious. Death confronts us with what philosophers call an epistemic boundary, a limit to possible knowledge that humility requires us to acknowledge. This doesn't mean abandoning the question, but rather approaching it with appropriate intellectual modesty. We can explore what survival would mean, what forms it might take, what would make it desirable or undesirable, what evidence bears on its likelihood. We can examine how different answers affect the meaning and conduct of present existence. We can appreciate the profound human need that drives survival hopes while acknowledging the genuine uncertainty that surrounds their fulfillment. In the end, the question of what survives death might be less important than the question of what survives in life, what aspects of existence prove most meaningful, most authentic, most worthy of preservation and development during the time we have. The philosophical exploration of mortality's mysteries can illuminate the nature of consciousness, identity, meaning, and value in ways that enrich present experience regardless of what may or may not await beyond the threshold of death. Living in the shadow of eternity, how mortality shapes meaning. In the cathedral of human experience, where moments of transcendence pierce through the ordinary fabric of daily existence, we discover that mortality itself might be the architect of meaning. The knowledge that our time is limited doesn't diminish the significance of human experience. It creates the very conditions under which significance becomes possible. Without the boundary of death, would love carry the same urgency? Would beauty inspire the same wonder? Would choice demand the same careful consideration? The philosopher William James observed that the reality of death transforms every human experience into what he called a once-born phenomenon. Each moment arrives with the implicit understanding that it will never repeat exactly. This unrepeatable quality infuses even mundane experiences with potential preciousness. The morning coffee tastes different when you recognize it as one of a finite number you'll ever drink. The conversation with a friend carries additional weight when you understand that all relationships exist within the boundaries of mortal time. This relationship between limitation and meaning operates throughout human experience. The musician knows that each performance is unique partly because it exists within irreversible time. The parent treasures childhood moments partly because they pass so quickly and completely. The lover's kiss intensifies in meaning because both participants carry awareness of mortality's eventual separation. Remove the element of temporality, and much of what we consider most precious about human existence loses its distinctive character. The temporal boundaries of existence create what philosophers call existential urgency, the sense that choices matter precisely because time for choosing is limited. In a world of infinite time and unlimited opportunities, decisions would carry little weight. Why choose carefully if every option remains perpetually available? Why commit deeply if relationships face no temporal constraints? Why create urgently if tomorrow offers identical creative possibilities? But mortality transforms decision-making into an art form requiring wisdom, courage, and acceptance of responsibility. The finite nature of existence means that choosing one path necessarily involves not choosing countless others. The reality of death ensures that commitments carry genuine stakes. The brevity of life demands that we develop criteria for distinguishing between trivial and significant pursuits. Consider how differently you might live if you knew with certainty that you had exactly 10 more years of existence. Would you continue your current job if it provides security but little satisfaction? Would you maintain relationships that drain energy without offering genuine connection? Would you postpone creative projects that express your deepest values? The knowledge of limited time would likely clarify priorities with remarkable speed and precision. This clarifying effect of mortality awareness appears consistently in the testimonies of people who have faced life-threatening illnesses. Cancer survivors often describe their diagnosis as a harsh teacher that revealed what truly mattered in their lives. Heart attack victims frequently report that their brush with death eliminated trivial concerns while intensifying focus on relationships and meaningful activities. The proximity of mortality seems to activate a different kind of intelligence, one that can instantly distinguish between authentic and artificial sources of meaning. Yet the relationship between death and meaning involves paradoxes that complicate simple formulations. While mortality creates urgency that can inspire profound living, the same mortality can also generate anxiety that prevents authentic engagement with life. The person obsessed with death's inevitability might become paralyzed rather than energized. The individual who cannot accept mortality's reality might waste precious time in futile attempts to achieve impossible security. The existentialist tradition has explored this paradox extensively, noting that authentic existence requires neither denial nor obsession regarding mortality, but rather a kind of courageous acceptance that allows engagement with life despite uncertainty about ultimate meaning. This acceptance doesn't eliminate anxiety but transforms it from paralyzing terror into creative tension that motivates meaningful action. The theologian Paul Tillich described this state as the courage to be, the willingness to affirm existence despite the anxiety that comes from recognizing its finite and uncertain nature. This courage doesn't depend on guarantees about survival or ultimate purpose, but emerges from commitment to creating meaning within the constraints of mortal existence. The courage to be includes the courage to love despite loss, to create despite impermanence, to hope despite uncertainty. Different wisdom traditions have developed practices for cultivating this courage in the face of mortality. Buddhist mindfulness meditation trains awareness of impermanence as a way of appreciating present moment experience without clinging to its continuation. Stoic philosophy emphasizes focusing on what remains within personal control, while accepting what lies beyond influence. Christian spirituality finds meaning through participation in divine love that transcends individual mortality while honoring the significance of temporal existence. The creative arts provide another domain where mortality's relationship to meaning becomes evident. Artists across cultures and centuries have drawn inspiration from the tension between temporal limitation and the desire for lasting significance. The knowledge that individual existence is brief motivates attempts to create works that might survive the creator's death. Yet the most powerful artistic expressions often emerge not from anxious grasping for immortality, but from deep engagement with the experience of being mortal. The Japanese aesthetic concept of mono no aware, often translated as the pathos of things, captures this relationship beautifully. It describes the bittersweet awareness of impermanence that makes beauty more rather than less poignant. Cherry blossoms are treasured, partly because they bloom briefly and fall quickly. The beauty lies not despite but because of the transient nature of the flowering. This aesthetic insight suggests that meaning might depend on impermanence rather than despite it. A song that played forever would lose its capacity to move us. A relationship that faced no temporal constraints might lack the intensity that comes from knowing time together is precious. A life that continued indefinitely might lose the urgency that motivates growth, commitment, and authentic choice. The implications extend beyond individual psychology to collective human endeavors. Why do civilizations create monumental architecture, preserve historical records, and transmit cultural wisdom across generations? Partly because they recognize that individual mortality threatens continuity, making conscious efforts at preservation necessary. The awareness of death motivates not only personal meaning-making, but also the collective projects through which human achievements transcend individual lifespans. Yet, even these collective efforts exist within larger temporal boundaries. Civilizations rise and fall, languages disappear, monuments crumble, and entire species become extinct. The universe itself faces ultimate heat death according to current scientific understanding. Does this cosmic perspective make human meaning-making futile? Or does it highlight the remarkable fact that consciousness has emerged at all within an apparently indifferent cosmos? The astrophysicist Carl Sagan suggested that we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. Temporary arrangements of matter and energy that have developed the capacity for self-awareness, love, creativity, and moral responsibility. From this perspective, human existence represents an extraordinary flowering of cosmic possibility that deserves celebration despite, or perhaps because of, its temporary nature. The recognition that meaning emerges within, rather than despite temporal limitations, offers practical guidance for navigating mortal existence. Instead of waiting for perfect circumstances or guaranteed outcomes before engaging fully with life, we can recognize that present conditions are the only conditions within which meaningful existence is possible. Instead of postponing important conversations or experiences until some future moment of complete readiness, we can appreciate that readiness itself is a luxury that mortality doesn't guarantee. This doesn't advocate for reckless living or the abandonment of planning and preparation. Rather, it suggests balancing future-oriented responsibility with present-moment engagement, recognizing that the meaning of existence emerges through the quality of consciousness we bring to whatever time we have. The art of mortal living involves neither denial of death nor obsession with it, but rather the cultivation of what might be called mortality-informed vitality, a way of being that draws energy from the recognition of limitation, rather than being depleted by it. In the gentle twilight of philosophical contemplation, where shadows lengthen and thoughts turn inward toward life's deepest mysteries, we find ourselves approaching the most profound territory any consciousness can explore. The question that has whispered through every human heart since awareness first sparked in ancient minds. What awaits us beyond the final threshold? This inquiry draws us into a conversation that spans millennia, connecting us with voices that have echoed through the corridors of time. From the serene gardens where ancient Greek philosophers first dared to claim death held no terror, to the meditation halls where Eastern sages discovered liberation through accepting impermanence, to the smoky cafes where modern thinkers wrestled with existence's apparent meaninglessness. Each tradition offers its own map for navigating the ultimate mystery, yet all share the recognition that how we understand death fundamentally shapes how we choose to live. The Garden Path, walking with ancient wisdom. Imagine walking through a quiet garden at dusk, where the air carries the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of water flowing over stone creates a natural rhythm for contemplation. This is the kind of setting where philosophical insight often emerges most naturally, away from the noise and urgency that typically characterize daily existence. Here, in this peaceful environment, we can begin to understand why certain ancient thinkers found such profound tranquility in their approach to mortality. The wisdom that emerged from these contemplative spaces wasn't born from academic theorizing, but from direct confrontation with the fears and anxieties that mortality creates. These philosophers understood that death anxiety operates like a background radiation of consciousness, subtly influencing every decision and relationship, even when we're not consciously aware of its presence. Their goal wasn't to provide comforting illusions, but to dissolve unnecessary suffering through clear seeing and rational understanding. What makes their approach so compelling is its practical orientation. These weren't abstract theoretical exercises, but therapeutic practices designed to free human beings from the psychological imprisonment that fear of death can create. The insights they developed were tested not in lecture halls, but in lived experience, refined through decades of applying philosophical principles to the actual challenges of mortal existence. This practical wisdom recognized that much of what we call the fear of death is actually fear of experiences we'll never have, pain we'll never feel, and losses we'll never endure. The fear relates more to imagination than reality, more to projection than actual experience. By carefully examining what death actually represents, rather than what our anxious minds create around the concept, a different relationship to mortality becomes possible. The therapeutic dimension of this approach extends beyond individual psychology to influence how we structure relationships, make decisions about time and energy allocation, and understand the proper scale of various concerns. When death anxiety diminishes, energy becomes available for full engagement with present experience. Relationships deepen because time together is recognized as precious without being haunted by constant awareness of eventual loss. The modern landscape. Existential territories. Moving forward through the centuries to more recent philosophical developments, we encounter thinkers who faced mortality in the aftermath of unprecedented historical trauma. The 20th century witnessed destructions and revelations that challenged traditional frameworks for understanding human existence and death's meaning. In response, new philosophical approaches emerged that neither denied mortality's reality nor sought comfort in transcendent promises, but instead found in death's inevitability the foundation for authentic living. These modern perspectives recognize that technological advancement and social progress hadn't eliminated the fundamental human confrontation with mortality, but had perhaps made it more complex and psychologically challenging. In societies where death often occurs in institutional settings, removed from daily experience, where medical technology can extend dying processes indefinitely, where traditional religious frameworks have lost their organizing power for many people, new approaches to mortality's meaning became necessary. The existential approach to death doesn't offer the serene acceptance we might find in ancient philosophical gardens or Eastern meditation halls. Instead, it embraces what might seem like a more challenging path, acknowledging that existence appears fundamentally groundless, that death seems to end everything we value about individual experience, and that meaning must be created rather than discovered through human choice and commitment. This perspective might initially appear more disturbing than comforting, but it contains a hidden liberation. If there's no predetermined script for how life should unfold, if death truly does represent the end of individual storytelling, then the time between birth and death becomes a space of radical freedom where authentic self-creation becomes possible. The anxiety that comes from confronting life's groundlessness can transform into energy for genuine engagement with existence. What emerges from this confrontation with mortality's apparent finality is often an intensified appreciation for the experiences available during temporal existence. Love becomes more precious because it's temporary. Creative expression gains urgency because the opportunity for creation is limited. Ethical choice takes on greater significance because the consequences of our actions shape the only reality we can be certain of experiencing. The practical implications of this approach often surprise people who initially find existential philosophy pessimistic. Rather than leading to despair or nihilistic indifference, honest confrontation with mortality's reality frequently produces what researchers now call post-traumatic growth, increased appreciation for life, clearer priorities, deeper relationships, and stronger sense of personal authenticity. Eastern streams, the flow of impermanence, in the gentle rhythm of Buddhist understanding, where wisdom emerges through patient observation of experience rather than analytical reasoning, we discover an approach to death that transforms our entire relationship to existence itself. This isn't philosophy in the Western sense of logical argumentation, but rather a systematic investigation into the nature of consciousness that reveals mortality as one movement within larger patterns of transformation. The Buddhist path begins with honest acknowledgement of what every sentient being experiences, the reality of suffering that emerges from the gap between how we want existence to be and how it actually unfolds. This suffering isn't a cosmic punishment or design flaw, but a natural consequence of consciousness itself, which constantly seeks permanence in a universe characterized by continuous change. Death, from this perspective, isn't an external enemy threatening otherwise stable existence, but simply the most obvious manifestation of impermanence that operates throughout every moment of conscious experience. The cells of our bodies are continuously dying and being replaced. The thoughts in our minds arise and dissolve without our conscious control. The relationships we treasure are constantly changing as the people involved grow and develop. Even our sense of individual identity shifts continuously as new experiences accumulate and old memories fade. This recognition of universal impermanence initially might seem to make life more precarious or frightening. If nothing lasts, if everything we love will eventually disappear, if even our own identities are constantly dissolving and reforming, where can we find security or peace? But Buddhist practice suggests that the attempt to find permanent security in impermanent phenomena is precisely what creates suffering. The solution isn't to find something permanent to cling to, but to develop a different relationship to impermanence itself. Through meditation practices that cultivate mindful awareness of present moment experience, practitioners begin to notice that impermanence isn't threatening but liberating. The painful emotion that seems overwhelming will pass. The difficult circumstances that appear permanent will change. Even the sense of being a solid, separate self that must be protected and preserved reveals itself as a construction that can be held more lightly. This doesn't lead to indifference or detachment from life, but rather to a quality of engagement that isn't constantly compromised by anxiety about loss. When you understand that everything is impermanent, including your own reactions to impermanence, a natural compassion emerges for all beings who are struggling with the same fundamental conditions of existence. The Buddhist understanding of death extends beyond individual mortality to encompass what they call the bardos, intermediate states between different phases of consciousness. Death becomes not termination, but transition, one moment in an ongoing flow of awareness that takes countless forms across vast spans of time. This doesn't necessarily require belief in literal reincarnation, but does suggest that consciousness participates in processes much larger than individual biographical existence. Contemporary convergence, where ancient and modern meet. In our current historical moment, where scientific understanding of consciousness advances rapidly while traditional sources of meaning continue to evolve, we find ourselves in a unique position to integrate insights from multiple philosophical traditions. The neuroscientist studying brain function during near-death experiences, the hospice worker observing the dying process, the meditation practitioner exploring the nature of awareness, and the existential therapist helping clients confront mortality anxiety are all contributing to a more comprehensive understanding of death's significance. This convergence doesn't necessarily resolve the fundamental mysteries surrounding mortality, but it does provide richer resources for navigating these mysteries with wisdom and grace. We can draw practical insights from Stoic acceptance, existential authenticity, Buddhist impermanence awareness, and contemporary psychological research without needing to choose a single orthodox position on what death ultimately means. What emerges from this integrative approach is recognition that death serves multiple functions in human experience. It creates the temporal boundaries that make choice meaningful. It generates the urgency that motivates authentic self-expression. It establishes the common vulnerability that connects us with all other conscious beings. It provides the contrast that allows us to recognize life as remarkable rather than routine. Perhaps most importantly, philosophical engagement with mortality reveals that the question, what happens after death, might be less significant than the question, what happens because of death? How does awareness of mortality influence the quality of consciousness during life? What would human experience lose if death weren't part of the equation? How can understanding death's role enhance rather than diminish our capacity for meaning, love, and creative expression? These questions don't require definitive answers to provide guidance for living. They invite ongoing contemplation that can deepen appreciation for the extraordinary fact of conscious existence, whatever its ultimate nature or duration might be. The philosophical exploration of death becomes not a morbid obsession, but a celebration of life's mysterious emergence within an apparently indifferent cosmos. The practice of mortality wisdom. As we integrate these various philosophical perspectives on death and mortality, practical wisdom begins to emerge that can guide daily living without requiring adherence to any particular metaphysical beliefs. This wisdom operates more like a compass than a map, providing orientation for navigating life's challenges while leaving room for individual interpretation and cultural variation. The first element of this practical wisdom involves developing what might be called mortality literacy, the ability to think and speak about death without being overwhelmed by anxiety or defensive denial. Just as financial literacy helps people make better decisions about money, mortality literacy helps people make better decisions about time, relationships, and priorities. This doesn't mean becoming obsessed with death, but rather developing a mature relationship with life's finite nature. Mortality literacy includes understanding the psychological mechanisms through which death anxiety operates, recognizing how fear of death influences behavior in subtle ways, and developing practices for maintaining perspective when mortality concerns arise. It involves learning to distinguish between productive concern about health and safety and neurotic anxiety about ultimate security. Most importantly, it includes cultivating the capacity to find meaning and joy in temporary experiences rather than demanding permanent guarantees before engaging fully with life. The second element involves what we might call presence practice, the development of attention skills that allow full engagement with immediate experience rather than constant distraction by past regrets or future anxieties. Every wisdom tradition that seriously engages with mortality emphasizes the importance of present moment awareness as both preparation for death and enhancement of life. This presence practice doesn't require formal meditation, though contemplative practices can certainly support its development. It can be cultivated through any activity that demands full attention and engagement. Gardening, cooking, listening deeply to another person, creative expression, or simply walking mindfully through natural environments. The The key is learning to inhabit experiences completely rather than treating them as means to some future end. The wisdom of unknowing. Perhaps the deepest insight that emerges from philosophical engagement with mortality is the recognition that some mysteries are meant to remain mysterious. The question of what happens after death pushes against the limits of what finite minds can definitively comprehend. Rather than seeing this limitation as frustrating, philosophical wisdom suggests embracing it as liberating. The unknowing that surrounds death's ultimate meaning creates space for wonder, humility, and what the poet Keats called negative capability. The two remain uncertain and in doubt without irritably reaching after fact and reason. This doesn't mean abandoning rational inquiry, but rather holding our conclusions lightly, remaining open to possibilities we haven't yet imagined. This wisdom of unknowing extends beyond death to encompass the entire mystery of conscious existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? How does awareness arise from apparent non-awareness? What is the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic processes? These questions invite contemplation rather than demanding definitive answers. The comfort that comes from embracing unknowing might seem paradoxical, but it reflects recognition that existence itself is more mysterious and wonderful than any explanation we could devise. The fact that consciousness has emerged at all within the universe, that beings like us can ponder questions like these, that love and beauty and meaning appear to emerge from purely physical processes, these realities are remarkable regardless of what happens when individual awareness ceases. Living the questions. As we conclude this exploration of philosophical approaches to death and mortality, we return to where we began, the recognition that how we understand death fundamentally shapes how we choose to live. The various traditions we've explored offer different maps for navigating mortality's mystery, but they converge in recognizing that death awareness can enhance rather than diminish the quality of conscious experience. The practical wisdom that emerges suggests neither denial of death nor obsession with it, but rather a middle path that acknowledges mortality while remaining fully engaged with the possibilities of present existence. This wisdom encourages us to hold our beliefs about death's meaning lightly while taking seriously the ethical and existential implications of our finite nature. Perhaps the most important insight is that the questions surrounding death and mortality are meant to be lived rather than solved. They invite ongoing contemplation that deepens appreciation for the remarkable fact of conscious existence, whatever its ultimate nature or duration might be. The philosophical exploration of death becomes not a search for definitive answers, but a practice that enriches every moment of life with greater presence, authenticity, and wonder. In the end, the philosophy of death returns us to the philosophy of life, illuminated now by understanding of the temporal boundaries that give existence its distinctive character. We find ourselves not diminished by mortality, but rather awakened to the extraordinary nature of our brief participation in the cosmic adventure of consciousness. The shadow of eternity, rather than darkening human experience, reveals its luminous depths that might otherwise remain hidden in the comfortable illusion of endless time. This awakening doesn't eliminate the natural sadness that accompanies loss or the anxiety that mortality can generate, but it does place these difficult emotions within a larger context of gratitude, wonder, and appreciation for the mysterious gift of awareness itself. We learn to hold both the sorrow and the joy, both the anxiety and the peace, both the questions and the not knowing, in a spacious embrace that honors the full spectrum of what it means to be conscious, mortal beings participating in existence's grand unfolding. The conversation continues, as it always has, in the quiet moments when we pause between activities and remember the mystery that surrounds us. It continues in the connections we make with others who share this strange condition of mortal consciousness which we attempt to capture. It continues in the creative expressions through something essential about the experience of being temporarily alive in an ancient universe. And it continues in the simple recognition that to be here at all, asking these questions, sharing these reflections, is itself a profound and unrepeatable gift. The gentle rhythm of seasons teaches us something profound about transition and renewal. In autumn, leaves release their hold on branches not through violent struggle, but through a natural process of letting go. The tree doesn't mourn each fallen leaf, but trusts in the deeper cycle that will bring fresh growth when conditions are right. This organic wisdom offers a different lens through which to view the great transition that awaits every conscious being. The ecology of endings, natural wisdom about transition. Walking through an old-growth forest, where fallen giants slowly decompose into fertile soil that nourishes new seedlings, we encounter nature's most elegant teaching about death and renewal. The massive trunk that once reached towards sunlight now provides nutrients for countless smaller lives. Mushrooms emerge from decaying wood, wildflowers bloom in clearings created by fallen trees, and the rich humus formed from generations of death creates the foundation for future forests. This ecological perspective suggests that death functions not as termination but as transformation within larger systems of renewal. What appears to end from one viewpoint continues from another, changing form while preserving essential elements. The carbon atoms that once composed a towering oak will eventually become part of other living beings. The space cleared by the tree's fall allows light to reach forest floor plants that had waited decades for their moment of growth. Indigenous wisdom traditions have long recognized these natural patterns as teachers for understanding human mortality. The Lakota understanding of death as returning to the earth from which we came reflects this ecological awareness. The Celtic recognition of death as one season in an eternal cycle of becoming echoes the forest's lesson about transformation rather than termination. These perspectives don't require supernatural beliefs, but simply acknowledge our participation in natural processes larger than individual existence. The comfort that emerges from this ecological understanding operates differently from philosophical arguments or religious promises. Instead of reasoning away death's reality or hoping for personal continuation, it places individual mortality within the context of ongoing life processes that transcend any single organism. We came from this earth and this cosmos, borrowed these atoms and this consciousness temporarily, and will return what we've borrowed to the source from which it emerged. This doesn't diminish the significance of individual existence, but rather reveals its connection to something infinitely larger. The brief flowering of human consciousness represents the universe's capacity for self-awareness temporarily manifested through particular nervous systems. When those systems cease functioning, the capacity for awareness doesn't disappear, but returns to whatever cosmic processes gave rise to it originally. The art of preparation, ancient practices for modern times. In monasteries around the world, where contemplatives have dedicated their lives to understanding existence's deepest questions, certain practices have emerged that help prepare consciousness for its ultimate transition. These aren't morbid obsessions with dying, but rather life-affirming disciplines that enhance present moment awareness while reducing anxiety about future uncertainty. The medieval practice of Lectio Divina, or sacred reading, involved slow, contemplative engagement with spiritual texts that addressed mortality's meaning. Practitioners would read brief passages multiple times, allowing insights to penetrate gradually rather than rushing toward intellectual understanding. This patient approach to wisdom cultivated the kind of receptive awareness that serves consciousness well, both in living and dying. Modern adaptations of such practices might involve regular contemplation of philosophical passages about mortality, not to memorize arguments, but to let wisdom settle gradually into lived understanding. The daily practice of reading reflections on death's meaning, combined with quiet sitting and receptive attention, can gradually transform anxiety into acceptance and fear into curiosity about existence's mysteries. The practice of gratitude journaling, recommended by contemporary psychology for its mental health benefits, actually echoes ancient preparation practices. Recording daily appreciations for simple experiences, relationships, and opportunities develops the kind of present moment awareness that makes death less threatening. When consciousness is fully engaged with immediate experience, the abstract future event of dying loses much of its psychological power. Some wisdom traditions recommend what might be called legacy reflection, regularly considering what traces of positive influence we might leave through our words and actions. This isn't about achieving fame or remembrance, but about recognizing how every interaction creates ripple effects that continue beyond individual existence. The kind word spoken to a struggling colleague, the patient attention given to a child's questions, the creative work that expresses authentic insight, these contributions continue influencing the world, regardless of whether their source is remembered. The practice of temporal meditation involves regularly contemplating the relative brevity of individual existence against cosmic timescales. Rather than creating anxiety, This practice often generates profound peace by revealing how perfectly natural and appropriate our temporary participation in consciousness actually is. We are stardust temporarily arranged in patterns capable of awareness, wonder, and love. What could be more remarkable than this brief flowering of cosmic possibility? The neuroscience of transcendence, when brain meets mystery. In research laboratories where scientists study consciousness during extraordinary states, fascinating discoveries are emerging about what happens to awareness at the boundaries of ordinary experience. Studies of meditation, masters, near-death experiencers, and people under the influence of psychedelic compounds reveal that consciousness has capacities and dimensions that normal waking awareness rarely accesses. Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, studying the effects of psilocybin on brain function, has discovered that the compound reduces activity in what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking and the sense of being a separate ego. When this network quiets down, people often report experiences of cosmic unity, dissolution of the fear of death, and profound peace that can persist long after the compound's effects wear off. These findings suggest that some of the anxiety surrounding death might stem from overactivity in brain regions that maintain our sense of being isolated individuals. When these regions relax their grip on consciousness, awareness often expands beyond the boundaries of personal identity to include connection with something much larger. The fear of personal annihilation dissolves when the boundaries of personhood become more fluid and permeable. Similar changes in brain activity occur during deep meditative states, profound religious experiences, and sometimes in the final stages of dying. The brain regions that normally maintain our sense of separate selfhood show decreased activity, while areas associated with feelings of connection and transcendence become more active. This suggests that consciousness itself might have natural capacities for moving beyond the limitations of individual identity. These scientific discoveries don't prove any particular theory about what happens after death, but they do suggest that consciousness has dimensions we're only beginning to understand. The subjective reports from people who have accessed these expanded states of awareness consistently describe reduced fear of death and increased sense of connection to something eternal or infinite within present experience. The philosophy of presence, finding eternity in the moment. Perhaps the most practical wisdom emerging from all philosophical approaches to mortality involves learning to inhabit present experience so completely that questions about future continuation become less urgent. This isn't escapism or denial, but rather recognition that the only reality we can directly access exists in the continuously unfolding now. The mystic tradition speaks of finding eternity within time, not as future destination, but as depth dimension available within each moment of awareness. When consciousness becomes fully absorbed in immediate experience, whether through meditation, creative flow, intimate connection, or simple mindful attention to ordinary activities, the usual anxieties about past and future naturally subside. This quality of presence doesn't require special techniques or altered states, but can be cultivated through any activity approached with complete attention. The gardener who becomes fully absorbed in the rhythm of planting and tending, the musician who disappears into the flow of improvisation, the parent who gives undivided attention to a child's story, all are accessing the timeless dimension that exists within temporal experience. From this perspective, the question isn't whether consciousness survives death, but whether we can fully inhabit consciousness while we have access to it. The person who has learned to be completely present has already touched something that transcends the usual boundaries of individual existence. Death becomes less threatening because presence itself reveals awareness as something larger than personal biography. This doesn't require believing in literal immortality, but does involve recognizing that consciousness participates in something that extends beyond individual minds. The capacity for awareness that looks through our eyes is the same capacity that has looked through countless eyes throughout history. Individual manifestations of consciousness arise and pass away, but the underlying capacity for awareness itself appears to be as fundamental to reality as matter and energy. The wisdom of acceptance, making peace with uncertainty. In the gentle space of accepting what cannot be known with certainty, a different kind of peace emerges, one that doesn't depend on having definitive answers, but finds comfort in the mystery itself. This acceptance doesn't represent giving up the search for understanding, but rather recognizing that some questions invite ongoing contemplation rather than final resolution. The uncertainty surrounding death's ultimate meaning can become a source of wonder rather than anxiety when approached with the right attitude. Like standing at the edge of a vast ocean whose depths we cannot fathom, the mystery of mortality can inspire awe and humility rather than fear. We are temporary arrangements of matter and energy that have somehow developed the capacity to ponder our own existence. This alone is remarkable enough to generate lifelong appreciation. This acceptance includes making peace with the possibility that individual consciousness might simply cease at death, while simultaneously remaining open to possibilities we cannot currently imagine. The honest acknowledgement that we don't know what happens after death can be more comforting than clinging to beliefs that anxiety keeps undermining. The practice of acceptance also involves releasing the need to have mortality make sense according to our human preferences. The universe doesn't owe us personal survival, cosmic justice, or ultimate meaning that satisfies our desires for permanence and significance. But this doesn't make existence meaningless. It makes the emergence of meaning within temporary existence all the more remarkable and precious. The legacy of love, what truly continues. As we approach the completion of this contemplative journey through philosophy's engagement with mortality, we encounter perhaps the most profound insight that emerges from honest exploration of death's meaning. While we cannot know with certainty what happens to individual consciousness after bodily death, we can observe directly how love transcends the boundaries of individual existence during life itself. The parent's love for a child doesn't depend on the parent's continued existence to influence the child's development. The teacher's wisdom doesn't require the teacher's presence to continue guiding former students' lives. The artist's vision doesn't need the artist's survival to keep inspiring future creativity. Love, wisdom, beauty, and truth have a kind of immortality that operates independently of the individuals through whom they first manifested. This isn't metaphysical speculation, but observable fact. The influence of love given, wisdom shared, beauty created, and truth revealed continues spreading through natural processes that death cannot interrupt. Every act of genuine caring creates effects that ripple forward through time, shaping circumstances and consciousness in ways that extend far beyond the actor's lifetime. From this perspective, the question of personal survival becomes less central than the question of what kind of influence we generate through our choices and actions. The consciousness that worries about its own continuation is the same consciousness that has the capacity to love, create, and contribute to the ongoing flourishing of life on Earth. How we use this capacity while we have it might be more significant than whether the capacity continues after our particular manifestation of it ends. The eternal return to wonder. In the quiet moments when philosophical exploration gives way to simple presence, we find ourselves returned to where we began, face to face with the fundamental mystery of conscious existence. The journey through various approaches to understanding death and mortality hasn't eliminated the mystery, but has perhaps made it more approachable, more friend than enemy. We discover that the question, what happens when we die, opens into larger questions about consciousness, time, meaning, and our place in the cosmic order. These questions don't demand final answers, but invite ongoing contemplation that enriches every moment of awareness with greater depth and appreciation. The various wisdom traditions we've explored offer different languages for expressing similar insights, that mortality gives life its poignancy and urgency, that awareness of death can enhance rather than diminish the quality of living, that acceptance of uncertainty can bring deeper peace than clinging to comforting beliefs, and that the love we give and receive might be the most important reality, regardless of what happens to individual identity after death. Perhaps the deepest teaching that emerges from philosophical engagement with mortality is simply this: the fact that we can ponder these questions at all is itself extraordinary. In a universe that appears mostly empty of consciousness, temporary arrangements of matter have developed the capacity for self-awareness, wonder, love, and the search for meaning. Whether this capacity continues beyond individual death or simply returns to the cosmic processes from which it emerged, its temporary flowering in beings like us represents something precious beyond measure. The gentle rhythm of breath that has accompanied this entire exploration continues its ancient dance of inspiration and expiration, drawing life from the atmosphere and releasing it, transformed back into the world. This simple process that sustains consciousness moment by moment embodies the fundamental pattern of receiving and releasing that characterizes all existence. We breathe in the gift of awareness, hold it briefly, and breathe it back into the mystery from which it came. In this rhythm, we find the template for approaching mortality with grace, receiving each moment as gift, inhabiting it fully, and releasing it without grasping when its time has passed. The breath that will someday cease altogether continues for now its patient work of keeping consciousness present to wonder at its own existence. And in that wonder, in that simple presence, in that grateful receiving and graceful releasing, we touch something that feels eternal, even within the embrace of time. The conversation about death and meaning continues in the space between breaths, in the pause between thoughts, in the silence that holds all questions and all possible answers. It continues in every moment when awareness recognizes itself as both utterly temporary and mysteriously connected to something that transcends individual existence. The philosophy of death returns us always to the philosophy of life, illuminated now by understanding of the boundaries that give existence its distinctive beauty and irreplaceable significance. The gentle settling of evening light through ancient library windows creates patterns that shift and fade like thoughts themselves. Here, in this sacred space where countless minds have wrestled with existence's deepest questions, we encounter a remarkable convergence of human wisdom about our ultimate destination. The dust motes floating in golden shafts of sunlight seem to dance with the same mysterious energy that animates consciousness itself, temporary, yet somehow eternal in their ceaseless movement. The Garden of Contemplative Practice, integrating wisdom traditions. In the peaceful synthesis of contemplative understanding, where Eastern and Western insights merge like streams flowing into a common river, we discover practical approaches to mortality that honor both reason and intuition. The meditation cushion and the philosopher's chair need not represent opposing territories, but can become complementary tools for exploring consciousness and its relationship to impermanence. Consider the daily practice of what we might call mortality meditation, a gentle discipline that combines rational reflection with mindful awareness. This isn't the grim rehearsal of dying, but rather a tender acknowledgement of life's temporal nature that enhances appreciation for present experience. The practitioner sits quietly each morning, perhaps with a cup of tea still warm in their hands, and simply acknowledges, "This day is unrepeatable. This moment is precious precisely because it will not come again." This acknowledgement doesn't create anxiety, but rather a quality of attention that transforms ordinary experience. The taste of the tea becomes more vivid, the feeling of breath moving in and out gains significance. The sounds of birds beginning their daily songs carry a poignancy that rushed consciousness might miss. The awareness of mortality serves not as burden, but as invitation to inhabit experience more completely. The practice extends throughout the day in subtle ways. The conversation with a friend is received with fuller presence because both participants understand, without speaking it directly, that all conversations exist within the boundaries of finite time. The work undertaken carries a different quality when approached with awareness that opportunities for meaningful contribution are limited and therefore precious. Even difficulties and challenges can be met with greater equanimity when viewed against the backdrop of mortality's larger perspective. This integrated approach draws wisdom from multiple traditions without requiring adherence to any particular metaphysical framework. The Stoic emphasis on focusing attention on what can be influenced combines naturally with Buddhist awareness of impermanence. Existentialist authenticity enhances rather than conflicts with Epicurean tranquility. The various streams of wisdom flow together in practical living that honors both mortality's reality and life's extraordinary richness. The science of consciousness at the threshold. In the quiet corridors of research hospitals, where scientists study consciousness during its most vulnerable moments, remarkable discoveries continue emerging about awareness itself. The monitoring equipment that tracks brain activity during near-death experiences reveals patterns that challenge conventional understanding of the relationship between mind and brain. Patients report vivid conscious experiences during periods when neural activity appears minimal, suggesting possibilities about consciousness that materialist frameworks struggle to accommodate. Dr. Pim van Lommel's longitudinal studies of cardiac arrest survivors have documented detailed accounts of awareness during clinical death that include verifiable information patients couldn't have acquired through normal sensory channels. While skeptics propose neurological explanations for these phenomena, the consistency and transformative impact of such experiences suggests they deserve serious consideration regardless of their ultimate interpretation. The neuroscientist Eben Alexander's own near-death experience during a week-long coma provided him with direct encounter with states of consciousness that seemed to operate independently of brain function. His scientific training made him initially skeptical of his own experience, but the profound transformation it produced in his understanding of consciousness and mortality couldn't be dismissed as mere hallucination or wish fulfillment. These scientific investigations don't prove any particular theory about survival of consciousness after death, but they do suggest that our understanding of awareness itself remains incomplete. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from objective neural processes, continues to puzzle researchers, leaving conceptual space for possibilities that strict materialism might prematurely exclude. The implications extend beyond theoretical speculation to practical questions about how to approach dying and death. If consciousness has capacities we don't fully understand, if awareness might persist through transitions we cannot directly observe, if the dying process involves dimensions of experience that transcend ordinary biological understanding, then preparation for death might involve more than simply accepting cessation of experience. The therapeutic wisdom of mortality counseling. In the gentle spaces where trained counselors help people navigate their relationships with mortality, profound healing often emerges through direct engagement with death anxiety rather than avoidance of it. The terror management that operates unconsciously in much human behavior, the desperate pursuit of symbolic immortality through achievement, offspring, or creative work, can be transformed into conscious choice about how to live meaningfully within temporal boundaries. The existential therapist Irvin Yalom has spent decades helping people confront what he calls the ultimate concerns of human existence: death, freedom, isolation, and meaninglessness. His approach involves creating safe therapeutic space where clients can explore their mortality anxiety without the usual psychological defenses. What emerges from this process is often surprising liberation rather than increased distress. Consider the case of Margaret, a successful attorney who came to therapy complaining of chronic anxiety and relationship difficulties. Traditional approaches had provided some relief, but hadn't addressed the underlying existential concerns that drove her compulsive achievement and people-pleasing behaviors. When she began exploring her fear of death directly, she discovered that much of her life had been organized around unconscious attempts to achieve symbolic immortality through professional success and others' approval. The therapeutic process didn't involve convincing Margaret to stop fearing death, but rather helping her understand how death anxiety had been shaping her choices in ways that prevented authentic living. As she developed a more conscious relationship with mortality, her need for external validation diminished while her capacity for genuine intimacy and creative expression expanded. The very anxiety she had been avoiding became the key to unlocking more authentic existence. This therapeutic approach recognizes that death anxiety isn't pathological, but rather a natural response to the human condition that becomes problematic only when it operates unconsciously. Bringing mortality concerns into conscious awareness allows for more intentional choices about how to respond to life's finite nature. Some people discover that their fear of death was actually fear of not having truly lived, which motivates them toward more authentic self-expression. Others find that confronting mortality directly reveals how many of their daily worries are relatively insignificant against the backdrop of existence's larger questions. The healing that emerges through mortality counseling often extends beyond individual psychological relief to influence relationships, career choices, and life priorities. People who have processed their death anxiety consciously frequently report deeper connections with loved ones, clearer sense of personal values, and greater willingness to take authentic risks rather than maintaining false security through conformity or avoidance. The art of conscious dying, modern death midwifery. In the growing movement toward conscious dying, where death doulas and spiritual counselors help people navigate their final transition with awareness and dignity, ancient wisdom about mortality finds contemporary expression. These modern death midwives don't promise to eliminate the challenges of dying, but rather to help people meet those challenges with greater consciousness and less fear. The death doula's role involves practical support, emotional presence, and spiritual guidance tailored to each person's unique needs and beliefs. For some, this means helping organize affairs, and for others, It involves guided communicate wishes to family members, meditation practices that cultivate equanimity in the face of physical decline. Still others benefit from philosophical discussions that place their individual death within larger contexts of meaning and continuity. What emerges consistently in conscious dying practices is the recognition that how people approach death significantly influences their experience of the dying process. Those who meet mortality with curiosity rather than terror, acceptance rather than desperate resistance, often report more peaceful transitions characterized by completion rather than interruption. This doesn't eliminate physical discomfort or emotional difficulty, but does transform the psychological relationship to these inevitable aspects of dying. The conscious dying movement has also revealed how death can become a teaching for those who witness it. Family members who participate in mindful death processes often describe profound spiritual experiences that transform their own relationships with mortality. Children who are included appropriately in conscious dying rituals frequently develop healthier attitudes toward death than those protected from direct encounter with life's natural cycles. These contemporary approaches to conscious dying draw wisdom from multiple traditions while adapting to modern circumstances. The Tibetan Buddhist understanding of death as opportunity for liberation combines with Western psychological insights about grief and trauma processing. Indigenous appreciation for death as return to the earth merges with scientific knowledge about the dying process. Religious concepts of divine accompaniment integrate with secular recognition of human dignity and choice. The practical techniques developed within conscious dying practices often prove valuable for people who aren't actively dying, but want to develop healthier relationships with mortality. Visualization exercises that help dying patients prepare for transition can also help healthy individuals process death anxiety. Meditation practices designed to cultivate equanimity during physical decline serve equally well for managing ordinary life stress with greater acceptance. The children's wisdom, learning from young philosophers. In the remarkable conversations that emerge when children encounter death directly, we often discover perspectives on mortality that adult sophistication has obscured. The child's natural curiosity about existence and death, unencumbered by years of anxiety and avoidance, can reveal insights that trained philosophers might miss in their elaborate theoretical constructions. 7-year-old Emma, whose grandmother died peacefully at home surrounded by family, asked her mother, "Where did Grandma's love go?" This simple question cuts to the heart of philosophical debates about consciousness, continuity, and what survives bodily death. Emma's mother, prepared to discuss heaven or other religious concepts, was surprised when Emma answered her own question. "I think it stayed in all of us who loved her." This child's intuitive understanding of love's persistence beyond individual death echoes insights from wisdom traditions, while avoiding the metaphysical complications that often make adult discussions of survival confusing or anxiety-provoking. Emma grasped something essential, that the most important aspects of human existence, love, kindness, wisdom, beauty, continue operating through natural processes that transcend individual mortality. Children's questions about death often reveal philosophical sophistication that adults underestimate. When 5-year-old Marcus asked whether his deceased pet remembers him, he was exploring fundamental questions about consciousness and memory that professional philosophers still debate. When 8-year-old Sophia wondered why people cry at funerals if the dead person isn't sad anymore, she was investigating the relationship between grief and love that requires considerable emotional intelligence to understand. Educational approaches that honor children's natural philosophical curiosity about death while providing age-appropriate support for processing mortality themes can help young people develop resilient relationships with life's impermanent nature. The child who learns early that death is a natural part of existence, that grief is expression of love, and that the most important human qualities transcend individual lifetimes, often carries this wisdom into adulthood with less anxiety and greater capacity for authentic living. The children's perspective on death also reminds adults of possibilities for wonder and acceptance that sophisticated analysis can sometimes obscure. The 4-year-old who decides that dead people become stars, watching over the living, has created a worldview that addresses psychological needs for comfort and continuity without requiring complex theological justification. While literally inaccurate, such childhood philosophies often contain emotional wisdom that more scientifically precise adult understanding might lack. the integration of mystery, living with sacred uncertainty. As our exploration of philosophical approaches to death and mortality draws toward its natural completion, we find ourselves in the spacious territory of sacred uncertainty. The recognition that some questions are meant to remain open rather than closed, invitations to ongoing contemplation rather than problems to be definitively solved. This sacred uncertainty doesn't represent intellectual failure or spiritual immaturity, but rather wisdom that comes from honestly acknowledging the limits of what finite minds can comprehend about infinite mysteries. The question of what happens after death pushes against the boundaries of possible knowledge in ways that can either frustrate or humble us, depending on our attitude toward unknowing itself. The mystic traditions have long recognized unknowing as a form of knowledge, not ignorance, but rather conscious relationship with mystery that transcends conceptual understanding. The medieval mystic known as Pseudo-Dionysius wrote of approaching divine mystery through learned ignorance, the recognition that ultimate reality exceeds the capacity of rational thought to grasp or contain. This approach to mystery creates space for multiple possibilities to coexist without demanding premature resolution. The materialist understanding of death as complete cessation, the religious vision of consciousness continuation, the Buddhist teaching of transformation within eternal becoming, the existentialist embrace of groundless meaning creation, all these perspectives can be held simultaneously as different ways of approaching the ultimately unknowable rather than competing claims that require choosing sides. The practical benefit of embracing sacred uncertainty about death involves liberation from the anxiety that comes from needing definitive answers to unanswerable questions. When we release the demand that existence makes sense according to our preferences for permanence and security, energy becomes available for fuller engagement with the mystery of being conscious at all. This doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or intellectual honesty, but rather holding our conclusions about mortality more lightly, with appropriate humility about the limits of human understanding. The scientist can pursue research into consciousness and near-death experiences, while acknowledging that the ultimate nature of awareness might transcend what empirical investigation can reveal. The religious believer can find comfort in traditional teachings about afterlife, while remaining open to possibilities beyond their particular theological framework. The eternal moment, presence as portal. In the gentle rhythm of breath that continues its ancient work of sustaining consciousness, we discover perhaps the most accessible gateway into understanding what might be called eternal within temporal existence. Each inhalation draws life from the vast atmosphere that connects all breathing beings across time and space. Each exhalation releases what has been temporarily borrowed back into the common reservoir from which it came. This breathing that we rarely notice unless it becomes difficult embodies the fundamental pattern of receiving and releasing that characterizes all existence. We receive the gift of conscious awareness, inhabit it briefly, and eventually release it back into whatever cosmic processes gave rise to it originally. The anxiety about what happens to individual consciousness after death might soften when we recognize this natural rhythm of emergence and return that operates throughout the natural world. The present moment, accessed through simple attention to breath or any other immediate experience, reveals dimensions that transcend ordinary temporal boundaries. In states of complete presence, whether achieved through meditation, creative absorption, intimate connection, or mindful attention to daily activities, consciousness touches something that feels eternal even while existing within time. This timeless quality of present moment awareness doesn't require believing in literal immortality, but does suggest that consciousness participates in something larger than individual biographical existence. The capacity for awareness that looks through our eyes is the same capacity that has looked through countless eyes throughout history and continues looking through countless eyes in the present moment. From this perspective, the question isn't whether individual consciousness survives death, but whether we can fully inhabit consciousness while we have access to it. The person who has learned to be completely present has already touched the eternal dimension that exists within temporal experience. Death becomes less threatening because presence itself reveals awareness as something that transcends the usual boundaries of personal identity. The practice of presence doesn't eliminate natural sadness about loss or anxiety about uncertainty, but places these emotions within a larger context of gratitude and wonder. When consciousness becomes fully absorbed in immediate experience, the usual preoccupations with past and future naturally subside. revealing the extraordinary nature of simply being aware at all. The completion of the circle, returning to wonder. As evening deepens and the library grows quiet around us, as the dust motes settle and the golden light fades into gentle darkness, we find ourselves returned to the fundamental wonder that initiated this entire exploration. The philosophical journey through various approaches to understanding death and mortality hasn't eliminated mystery, but has perhaps made it more approachable, more friend than enemy. The various wisdom traditions we've encountered offer different languages for expressing what might be a common recognition. That mortality gives existence its distinctive character, that awareness of death can enhance rather than diminish the quality of living, that acceptance of uncertainty often brings deeper peace than clinging to comforting certainties, and that the love and wisdom we share during our brief time here might represent the most significant realities regardless of what happens to individual identity after death. The child's question, "What happens when we die?" opens like a flower into larger questions about consciousness, meaning, connection, and our place in the vast cosmos that has given rise to beings capable of asking such questions at all. These inquiries invite ongoing contemplation rather than demanding final resolution, creating space for wonder to flourish alongside knowledge. Perhaps the deepest insight emerging from philosophical engagement with mortality is the recognition that the capacity for pondering these questions represents something extraordinary in itself. In a universe that appears mostly unconscious, temporary arrangements of matter and energy have developed the ability for self-awareness, love, creativity, and the search for meaning. Whether this capacity continues beyond individual death or returns to the cosmic processes from which it emerged, its flowering in beings like us constitutes something precious beyond measure. The gentle settling of dusk outside the library windows mirrors the natural rhythm of completion that characterizes all phenomena. The day doesn't resist its ending, but yields gracefully to night, trusting in cycles of renewal that extend beyond any single day's experience. In this natural rhythm, we find a template for approaching our own mortality, not with desperate resistance, but with graceful acceptance of our place within larger patterns of emergence and return. The conversation about death and meaning continues in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that holds all questions and all possible answers. It continues in every moment when awareness recognizes itself as both utterly temporary and mysteriously connected to something eternal. The philosophy of death returns us always to the philosophy of life, illuminated now by understanding of the boundaries that give existence its irreplaceable beauty and profound significance. In the deepening quiet, where philosophy gives way to presence and analysis yields to simple being, we rest in the mystery that has accompanied us throughout this journey. The breath continues its patient work, drawing from the infinite and returning to the infinite, carrying consciousness like a gentle wave that rises briefly from the ocean and returns again to its source, having touched the shore of existence with its own unique pattern of foam and light. The quiet settling that follows deep contemplation brings us to a place where philosophy becomes lived experience, where abstract ideas transform into practical wisdom for navigating the delicate art of mortal existence. In this gentle space between knowing and unknowing, we discover that the greatest philosophers weren't those who solved the mystery of death, but those who learned to dance gracefully with its eternal questions. The daily practice of philosophical living. In the soft morning light that filters through bedroom curtains, where consciousness first stirs from sleep's temporary dissolution, we have our most natural laboratory for understanding death's relationship to existence. Each awakening from sleep offers a small rehearsal for the larger questions of consciousness and continuity that mortality poses. We emerge from hours of unconsciousness with our sense of identity intact, yet something has clearly paused and resumed in ways we cannot fully explain. The philosophical life begins with paying attention to these ordinary miracles of consciousness. The first breath of the day carries with it all the mystery of awareness returning from wherever it travels during sleep. The initial thoughts that arise seem to emerge from emptiness, much as consciousness itself appears to arise from the apparent nothingness that preceded our birth. These daily transitions between sleeping and waking offer gentle practice for contemplating the larger transition that awaits every conscious being. Consider how differently the day unfolds when approached with what we might call philosophical presence, the quality of attention that remains aware of existence's mysterious nature, even while engaging with practical necessities. the morning coffee becomes an opportunity to contemplate the temporary nature of all experiences, including the experience of drinking coffee. The conversation with a family member carries additional depth when both participants understand, without speaking it directly, that all relationships exist within the embrace of finite time. This philosophical awareness doesn't create morbid preoccupation with death, but rather heightens appreciation for the extraordinary fact of being conscious at all. The person who truly understands mortality often becomes more rather than less engaged with life, because every moment is recognized as both precious and unrepeatable. The anxiety that typically accompanies thoughts of death begins to transform into wonder at the remarkable gift of temporary awareness. The practical application of philosophical wisdom about mortality shows up in countless small choices throughout each day. The decision to listen fully when someone speaks, knowing that opportunities for connection are limited. The choice to notice beauty in ordinary surroundings, recognizing that aesthetic experience depends on consciousness that won't last forever. The willingness to forgive quickly and love openly, understanding that time for such expressions exists within definite boundaries. The meditation of impermanence in daily life. Walking through a garden where flowers bloom and fade according to their natural cycles, we encounter one of philosophy's most accessible teachers about mortality and meaning. The rose that opens its petals to morning sunlight doesn't resist the inevitable wilting that will come with evening. Its beauty emerges precisely through its willingness to be fully present during its brief flowering, holding nothing back because permanence isn't possible. This natural wisdom offers profound guidance for human existence. The meditation on impermanence doesn't require formal sitting practice, but can be cultivated through mindful attention to the constant changes occurring in every moment of experience. The breath that rises and falls, the thoughts that appear and dissolve, the emotions that intensify and fade, all provide opportunities for understanding the temporary nature of phenomena without being disturbed by it. The ancient Buddhist teaching about impermanence reveals itself not as abstract doctrine, but as immediate reality available for direct observation. Watch how the light changes throughout a single hour as clouds pass across the sun. Notice how conversations evolve from topic to topic without conscious direction. Observe how the body's sensations shift continuously without any effort on our part. Everything we can observe is in constant flux, including the observer itself. This recognition of universal impermanence gradually transforms the relationship to personal mortality. When we truly understand that everything is temporary, thoughts, feelings, relationships, achievements, problems, the fear of personal ending begins to dissolve into acceptance of natural process. Death becomes not catastrophic interruption of permanent existence, but simply the final movement in a dance of impermanence that has been unfolding throughout our entire lives. The meditation on impermanence also reveals how clinging to experiences creates unnecessary suffering. The attempt to make temporary phenomena permanent, whether through desperately grasping pleasurable experiences or through avoiding inevitable losses, generates the psychological tension that Buddhist teaching identifies as the root of human dissatisfaction. Learning to appreciate impermanent experiences without demanding their continuation brings profound relief from the anxiety that typically accompanies awareness of mortality. Yet this acceptance of impermanence doesn't lead to indifference or detachment from life, but rather to deeper engagement with present experience. When we truly understand that this moment will never come again, attention naturally becomes more focused and appreciative. The temporary nature of experience makes it more rather than less precious, like seasonal flowers that bloom briefly and therefore inspire special wonder. The existential courage of authentic living. In the honest recognition that existence appears groundless, that death seems to end individual storytelling, that meaning must be created rather than discovered, we encounter the particular form of courage that existential philosophy demands. This isn't the heroic bravery celebrated in adventure stories, but rather the quiet determination to live authentically despite uncertainty about ultimate purpose or survival. The existential understanding of mortality begins with unflinching acknowledgement that traditional sources of meaning, religious promises, social conventions, family expectations, may not provide adequate foundation for navigating life's fundamental questions. This recognition can initially feel terrifying, like standing at the edge of an abyss where all familiar landmarks have disappeared. But within this apparent emptiness lies hidden liberation. When external authorities no longer dictate how life should be lived, when cosmic purposes no longer justify individual choices, when death truly represents the end of personal narrative, then the time between birth and death becomes space for radical self-creation. The anxiety that comes from confronting existential groundlessness can transform into energy for genuine authenticity, for living according to values chosen freely rather than inherited unconsciously. Consider how this existential perspective transforms daily decision-making. The career choice made from authentic interest rather than social expectation. The relationship pursued because of genuine connection rather than fear of loneliness. The creative project undertaken because it expresses something true rather than because it might achieve recognition. Each decision becomes opportunity for self-creation rather than conformity to external standards. The existential approach to mortality doesn't offer comfort through promises of survival or transcendent meaning, but instead finds dignity in the very act of creating meaning despite uncertainty. This meaning emerges through conscious choice rather than passive acceptance, through commitment to values that may have no cosmic validation, but nevertheless guide action in ways that feel authentic and worthwhile. The courage required for this existential approach extends beyond individual psychology to influence relationships and social engagement. The person who has accepted mortality's finality often becomes more rather than less concerned with justice, compassion, and human flourishing, because these values matter within the context of shared finite existence, even if they receive no eternal validation. The Stoic Garden of Acceptance. In the peaceful cultivation of what can be influenced while accepting what cannot be changed, we discover the particular wisdom that Stoic philosophy offers for navigating mortality with grace and effectiveness. This ancient approach to death doesn't deny the reality of loss or pretend that mortality poses no challenges, but rather develops practical strategies for maintaining equanimity in the face of life's inevitable difficulties. The Stoic understanding begins with careful distinction between what lies within personal control and what operates according to natural laws beyond individual influence. Death itself clearly falls into the category of things beyond our control. Its timing, manner, and ultimate meaning remain largely mysterious despite advances in medical knowledge. But our response to mortality, our preparation for death, and our attitude toward life's temporary nature remain entirely within the sphere of personal choice. This recognition creates profound liberation from the anxiety that typically accompanies thoughts of death. Instead of wasting energy on futile attempts to prevent or postpone mortality indefinitely, the Stoic focuses attention on living well during whatever time is available. This shift from trying to control outcomes to managing responses transforms the relationship to uncertainty from source of distress into opportunity for character development. The daily practice of Stoic wisdom involves regular reflection on mortality not to create fear, but to maintain perspective on what truly matters. The executive who remembers death's inevitability might spend less energy on status competition and more on meaningful work. The parent who accepts life's temporary nature might focus on present connection with children rather than anxious planning for their distant future. The artist who embraces mortality might create more authentic work because external recognition becomes less important than honest expression. The Stoic approach to grief and loss provides particularly valuable guidance for navigating the deaths of others. Rather than viewing mourning as purely emotional reaction beyond rational influence, Stoicism suggests that how we process loss reflects choices about how to honor both the deceased and our continuing relationships with their memory. Excessive grief that prevents engagement with ongoing life responsibilities dishonors both the dead and the living, while appropriate mourning that processes loss without being consumed by it maintains healthy connection across the boundary of death. The philosophical preparation for one's own death that Stoicism recommends doesn't involve morbid preoccupation, but rather practical wisdom about how to live fully while accepting mortality's reality. This preparation includes cultivating virtues that remain valuable regardless of lifespan, developing relationships based on mutual respect rather than desperate attachment, and engaging in work that contributes to human flourishing, whether or not individual recognition survives. The oceanic consciousness of unity. In the vast expanse of awareness that occasionally opens during moments of profound meditation, creative absorption, or intimate connection, We sometimes touch what mystics across traditions have described as oceanic consciousness, the recognition that individual awareness participates in something much larger than personal identity. These experiences don't require supernatural beliefs to provide insight into mortality's ultimate meaning. The boundaries that normally separate self from world, observer from observed, consciousness from its contents, can sometimes dissolve in ways that reveal their constructed nature. During such moments, the fear of death that typically haunts individual identity loses its grip because the sense of being a separate entity requiring protection has temporarily dissolved. What remains is pure awareness without the usual anxiety about its continuation or termination. These oceanic experiences often occur spontaneously during activities that require complete absorption, playing music, creating art, making love, walking in nature, or simply sitting quietly without agenda. The common element appears to be the temporary suspension of self-referential thinking, the mental commentary that normally maintains our sense of being isolated individuals navigating a foreign environment. When the boundaries of personal identity become fluid, consciousness reveals itself as more like space than like a thing occupying space. Just as physical space provides the context within which all objects appear and disappear without itself being affected, awareness provides the context within which all experiences arise and pass away, without the awareness itself being diminished or enhanced. From this perspective, death appears as the dissolution of a particular pattern within awareness rather than the termination of awareness itself. The practical implications of occasionally accessing oceanic consciousness extend far beyond the experiences themselves. People who have touched this dimension of awareness often report lasting changes in their relationship to mortality, including reduced anxiety about personal death and life. The recognitioned, increased sense of connection to all that consciousness extends beyond personal boundaries, doesn't eliminate individual identity, but holds it more lightly, with less desperate attachment to its continuation. This oceanic understanding doesn't contradict scientific insights about consciousness and brain function, but rather adds dimensions of subjective experience that purely objective investigation might miss. Whether consciousness ultimately survives individual death remains unknown, but the direct experience of awareness as something larger than personal identity provides comfort and perspective that can transform how mortality is approached and understood. The children's philosophy of wonder. In the remarkable conversations that emerge when young minds encounter mortality directly, we often discover perspectives that adult sophistication has learned to avoid or complicate unnecessarily. The child's natural curiosity about death and dying, unencumbered by years of anxiety and theological speculation, can reveal insights that professional philosophers might overlook in their elaborate theoretical constructions. 6-year-old Anna, whose pet hamster died during the night, asked her father, "Where do dreams go when we wake up?" When he explained that dreams disappear when consciousness shifts to waking state, she nodded thoughtfully and said, "Maybe that's where Fluffy went back to wherever dreams come from. Lost." This simple analogy captures something essential about consciousness and its mysterious origins that complex philosophical arguments often obscure through overanalysis. Children's questions about death frequently reveal intuitive understanding of concepts that adults find intellectually challenging. The 4-year-old who asks whether dead people still think is exploring the relationship between consciousness and bodily existence. The 7-year-old who wonders whether her grandmother can see her from heaven is investigating the possibility of continued awareness after physical death. These inquiries deserve serious engagement rather than dismissive reassurance or premature theological answers. The child's approach to mortality often combines acceptance with wonder, in ways that adult thinking has learned to separate. Young children frequently express curiosity about death without the paralyzing anxiety that typically accompanies adult contemplation of mortality. They ask practical questions about the dying process, wonder about the experiences of dead people, and create imaginative theories about what happens after death, all while maintaining engagement with present moment living. Educational approaches that honor children's philosophical curiosity about mortality while providing age-appropriate support for processing death-related themes can help young people develop resilient relationships with life's impermanent nature. The child who learns early that death is a natural part of existence, that questions about mortality are normal and important, and that wonder is an appropriate response to mystery often carries this wisdom into adulthood with less anxiety and greater authenticity. The children's perspective also reminds adults of possibilities for approaching mortality with freshness rather than habitual dread. The young mind that hasn't yet been trained to fear death can sometimes perceive aspects of mortality that older consciousness has learned to avoid. Their questions and observations can serve as invitations for adults to rediscover wonder and curiosity about existence's deepest mysteries. The integration of sacred doubt. As our philosophical journey through mortality's landscape approaches its natural rhythm of completion, we find ourselves in the spacious territory where certainty yields to mystery, where knowing embraces unknowing, where the various wisdom traditions we've explored converge in recognition that some questions are meant to remain open rather than closed. This isn't intellectual failure, but rather the beginning of genuine wisdom about existence's ultimate nature. The sacred doubt that emerges from honest philosophical inquiry into death and mortality doesn't represent skepticism that dismisses all possibilities, but rather humility that acknowledges the limits of what finite minds can comprehend about infinite mysteries. The question of what happens after death pushes against the boundaries of possible knowledge in ways that can either frustrate or inspire us, depending on our relationship to uncertainty itself. This sacred doubt creates space for multiple perspectives to coexist without demanding premature resolution. The materialist understanding of death as complete cessation, the religious vision of consciousness continuation, the Buddhist teaching of transformation within eternal becoming, the existentialist embrace of meaning creation despite groundlessness, all these approaches can be held simultaneously as different ways of engaging mystery rather than competing claims requiring partisan allegiance. The practical benefit of embracing sacred doubt about mortality involves liberation from the anxiety that comes from needing definitive answers to ultimately unanswerable questions. When we release the demand that existence make complete sense, according to our preferences for permanence and security, energy becomes available for fuller engagement with the mystery of being conscious at all, regardless of how long that consciousness might last. This integration of doubt with wonder doesn't mean abandoning critical thinking or intellectual honesty, but rather holding our conclusions about mortality more gently, with appropriate recognition of human understanding's inherent limitations. The scientist can pursue research into consciousness while acknowledging that awareness might transcend what empirical investigation can reveal. The religious believer can find comfort in traditional teachings while remaining open to possibilities beyond particular theological frameworks. The wisdom that emerges from philosophical engagement with mortality ultimately returns us to the fundamental wonder that initiated our entire exploration. We find ourselves not with final answers, but with deeper appreciation for the questions themselves, not with elimination of mystery, but with more graceful relationship to the unknown, not with conquest of death, but with more authentic ways of living within mortality's embrace. In the gentle rhythm of breath that continues its patient work of sustaining consciousness, in the natural cycles of day and night that mirror larger patterns of emergence and return, in the simple miracle of awareness recognizing its own temporary nature, we discover that the philosophy of death continuously returns us to the philosophy of life, illuminated now by understanding of the boundaries that give existence its distinctive beauty and irreplaceable meaning. The conversation continues in every moment when consciousness recognizes itself as both utterly finite and mysteriously connected to something eternal, when individual awareness touches the universal mystery from which it temporarily emerges, and to which it will eventually return, carrying with it the precious gift of having wondered, having loved, having participated briefly but fully in the grand adventure of conscious existence within an ancient and ongoing cosmos. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the veil between sleeping and waking grows thin, we arrive at perhaps the most profound recognition that philosophical contemplation can offer. The various paths we've walked together through ancient gardens and modern laboratories, through Eastern meditation halls and Western libraries, converge in a single, luminous understanding. The approach to death reveals everything about how we choose to live. Consider the extraordinary fact that you are here, in this moment, capable of contemplating your own mortality. Of all the countless arrangements of matter and energy that have existed throughout cosmic history, you represent one temporary configuration that has developed the remarkable capacity for self-awareness, for questioning its own nature, for wondering about its ultimate destiny. This capacity itself is so improbable, so precious, that its temporary duration cannot diminish its fundamental miracle. The philosopher who sits peacefully with mortality's mystery, and the scientist who studies consciousness at its boundaries, the meditator who observes impermanence, and the artist who creates beauty knowing it will fade, the parent who loves deeply despite inevitable separation, and the friend who offers presence without demanding permanence, all participate in the same recognition. Consciousness itself, regardless of its duration or ultimate fate, represents something extraordinary enough to inspire lifelong gratitude. This understanding transforms the question from, how can I avoid death? To, how can I most fully inhabit the gift of awareness while it's available? The shift is subtle, but profound. Instead of living in constant flight from mortality, we begin living in conscious appreciation of temporality. Instead of demanding guarantees about survival, we discover meaning in the very capacity to ask such questions. The gentle rhythm that has carried us through this exploration continues in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, in the silence that holds all our wondering. Whether consciousness continues beyond individual death or returns to the cosmic processes from which it emerged, the fact that it arose at all within an apparently unconscious universe remains remarkable beyond measure. We are the cosmos becoming aware of itself, temporary arrangements of ancient starlight that have learned to contemplate their own existence. In this recognition, fear transforms into wonder, anxiety dissolves into presence, and the great question of mortality reveals itself not as problem requiring solution, but as mystery deserving celebration. The philosophy of death, explored with courage and curiosity, becomes the deepest possible affirmation of life's extraordinary nature. We need not solve the riddle to dance with its beauty, need not eliminate uncertainty to find peace within its embrace. The conversation continues in every breath freely given and gracefully received, in every moment of consciousness fully inhabited, in every recognition that to be here at all, questioning and wondering and briefly participating in existence's grand unfolding, is itself the most profound answer to mortality's eternal question. As we reach the gentle close of this contemplative journey, settling into the quiet space where all questions find their rest, we discover that the philosophy of death has been teaching us something far more essential than answers about what lies beyond. It has been revealing the art of being fully alive, from Epicurus teaching us that death is nothing to fear because we cannot experience non-existence, to Heidegger showing us how mortality awareness creates authentic living, from Buddhist wisdom about impermanence as liberation to existentialist courage in creating meaning despite uncertainty. Each tradition offers the same fundamental invitation: to wake up, to be present, to recognize the extraordinary gift of consciousness itself. The question, what happens when we die, opens like ripples on water into the deeper recognition of what it means to be temporarily, miraculously alive. Whether individual awareness continues beyond death or dissolves back into cosmic process, whether consciousness survives or transforms, whether meaning endures or exists only in the living moment, these mysteries remain beautifully, necessarily open. But in exploring them together, something has shifted. The anxiety that often accompanies thoughts of mortality has perhaps softened into curiosity. The desperate grasping for certainty has maybe relaxed into acceptance of mystery. The fear of ending has possibly transformed into gratitude for beginning, for being here at all in this brief flowering of awareness within an ancient universe. The breath that sustains this moment will continue its patient rhythm, drawing life from the boundless atmosphere and releasing it back transformed, embodying the fundamental pattern of receiving and releasing that characterizes all existence. In this simple process, we find the template for approaching mortality with grace, holding each moment as gift while remaining unattached to its permanence. The conversation about death and meaning continues in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, wherever consciousness recognizes itself as both utterly temporary and mysteriously connected to something eternal. The philosophy of death returns us always to the philosophy of life, illuminated now by understanding of the boundaries that give existence its irreplaceable beauty. In the end, we find ourselves not diminished by mortality, but awakened to the profound significance of our brief participation in the cosmic adventure of consciousness. The shadow of eternity, rather than darkening human experience, reveals its luminous depths. We are stardust that learn to wonder about its origins, temporary arrangements of matter and energy that develop the capacity for love, creativity, and the search for meaning. This recognition transforms everything. Each conversation becomes precious because all relationships exist within time's embrace. Each creative expression gains urgency because opportunities for creation are finite. Each moment of beauty intensifies because consciousness itself is revealed as a rare and fragile gift. We need not solve mortality's mystery to dance with its profound teachings about what it means to be authentically, courageously, gratefully alive.